boxcar was colder than Jack had ever imagined a night could be. The wooden walls rattled faintly with every turn of the wheels, each vibration reminding him of just how thin the barrier was between himself and the vast, frozen world outside. The air had weight, a heavy, crystalline edge that seemed to press against his lungs with each shallow breath. He tried to curl tighter in his threadbare coat, but it was useless. His body shivered violently, teeth clattering so loudly he feared other riders might hear them across the train. The storm outside had already stripped the stars from the sky. Darkness pressed in from every angle, so complete that even the snow falling through cracks in the roof looked like shadows instead of light. He tried to rub warmth back into his hands, but they had gone beyond numb. Pain had faded into that eerie emptiness, which meant frostbite wasn't far away. Jack knew then what he had denied for hours. He wasn't going to make it through the night, and that was when the door scraped open. A wedge of faint light and colder air blasted in. A figure pulled himself through with practiced efficiency, sliding the door shut behind him in one smooth motion. No wasted effort, no hesitation, just control. The newcomer shook snow from his shoulders and scanned the interior. His presence filled the space in a way that made the storm outside seem distant, irrelevant. Jack tried to sit up straighter, but the chill had hollowed him out. The man crouched down, assessing him with eyes sharpened by long winters. He didn't waste words on introductions. He just said, calm as stone, "You're dying wrong." At first, Jack thought he was hallucinating, but the man reached for the bundle on his back and began pulling out sheaves of crumpled newspaper. He spread them out methodically, as if laying the pieces of some strange puzzle. "Take that coat off," the man ordered. Jack blinked in disbelief. Take it off? In this cold? He wanted to protest, but there was something in the man's tone. Absolute certainty, like a carpenter explaining where to place a nail. Against all instinct, Jack obeyed, shrugging out of the frozen coat that felt like a stiff shell. His body screamed at the exposure, but the man was already wrapping him in the papers, layer after layer, overlapping them like shingles on a roof. "Weight doesn't save you," the man explained in a low voice. "Air does. Paper traps it, seals it, keeps your heat in, keeps the cold out." His hands moved fast but careful, tucking corners, smoothing folds, securing gaps. Jack could feel the difference almost immediately. The biting edge of the air no longer slid straight into his bones. The thin, crackling barrier of newspaper created a strange warmth, fragile, yet real. The man leaned back and nodded in approval. "Better? You'll live now." For the first time in hours, Jack took a full breath without the shiver of panic attached. He looked at his rescuer more closely. The man's face was weathered, carved by years of cold wind, but his eyes carried no panic, only focus. His layers were perfect. Newspapers inside, burlap and wool outside, each piece chosen for a reason. This wasn't luck, this was skill. Jack finally found his voice. "Who are you?" The man adjusted his own wrappings, tucking in a flap near his neck. He answered simply, "Writers call me Newspaper Pete." The name meant nothing to Jack then, but the way he said it, without pride, without ceremony, just fact, told him it mattered on the rails. Pete didn't ask what Jack's name was. Not yet. Instead, he scanned the boxcar, locating the weak points where snow had been drifting in. With quick motions, he stuffed paper into cracks, creating seals against the wind. You jumped blind, didn't you? Pete asked finally. Jack nodded, ashamed. First winter ride? Another nod. Pete gave a low hum. Not judgment, just acknowledgement. Then you're lucky this isn't your last. Winter doesn't forgive ignorance. Jack tried to smile, but his lips cracked from the cold. I thought, just get in, stay still, ride it out. That's how you die, Pete replied simply. He reached for another paper, folding it deftly, sliding it under Jack's layers. Staying still lets the cold creep in. You've got to move, adjust, patch, watch every seam. Survival isn't passive, it's a craft. The words settled into Jack's bones as much as the warmth did. Survival as a craft, something you built, like carpentry, something that could be learned if someone taught you. Pete worked silently for a few minutes more, finishing his adjustments. Then, with the same calm tone, he said, Now, we make shelter. He guided Jack to one corner of the boxcar, away from the draft of the door. With practiced precision, he stacked crates and loose boards, building walls within walls. He layered newspaper and rags between them, creating insulation. The structure seemed crude, but as they crawled inside, the difference was immediate. The air stilled, the temperature shifted. It wasn't comfort, but it was survivable. Pete settled in across from him, pulling a small tin from his coat. Inside was a lump of hardened fat wrapped in cloth. He shaved a bit off with his knife and pressed it into Jack's hands. Eat. High fat keeps you warm, longer than bread or beans. Jack bit into it, hesitantly. It tasted like nothing he'd ever call food, but within minutes he felt a strange surge of energy. Pete chewed his own piece slowly, like a man who knew the value of every bite. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing. Snow hissed through the cracks they hadn't sealed. The wheels thundered beneath them, carrying the train deeper into the frozen night. Yet inside their fragile corner shelter, the cold no longer felt like an unstoppable predator. It was something that could be managed, delayed, outwitted. Jack finally whispered, Why help me? Pete's eyes didn't leave the wall he was reinforcing. Because someone once helped me. That's how it works out here. Knowledge gets passed on, or it dies with you. And if it dies, so do the next riders. The words carried more weight than the storm. Knowledge wasn't just a tool. It was the thin line that separated survival from death. Pete had chosen to share it, and in doing so, had given Jack more than warmth. He had given him a chance to live another night. Hours passed in that insulated corner. Pete showed him how to rotate positions to share body heat, how to check seams for leaks, how to listen for the subtle shifts in the train that signaled danger ahead. Jack absorbed every detail, desperate to prove he was worth saving. When exhaustion finally pulled at his eyes, he fought it, fearing that sleep meant death. But Pete reassured him, calm as ever. 2-hour watches. I'll take first. You sleep. Jack obeyed, curling into the newspaper cocoon. For the first time since climbing into the boxcar, he didn't feel like prey, waiting for the cold to finish its work. He felt protected, not safe, never safe, not on the winter rails, but guided. As sleep overtook him, the rhythm of the train softened into a strange lullaby, the sound of steel wheels carrying him eastward into a world he didn't yet understand. Beside him, Newspaper Pete kept watch, eyes steady, listening to the storm, with the calm of a man who had seen nights colder, darker, and survived them all. Jack's journey had begun with desperation, with the thought that perhaps freezing in a boxcar was easier than facing the ruins of his old life. But as he drifted into exhausted sleep, wrapped in the crackling armor of newspapers, a new thought surfaced, one he hadn't dared consider in weeks. Maybe he wanted to live after all. The morning after the storm broke across the plains, Jack woke to the soft rustling of newspaper. At first, he thought he was dreaming of city mornings, of delivery boys tossing bundles onto porches. But when he opened his eyes, he saw Pete, crouched near the corner of their improvised shelter, adjusting the layers of insulation with deliberate hands. The boxcar was still cold, but different now. The brutal edge had softened. Like a wolf that had retreated a few paces, Jack's breath still fogged in the air. But the simple barrier Pete had built with paper and boards had kept the worst of the night outside. He realized with a start that he was alive, truly alive, not just clinging to the last flickers of heat. Pete noticed him stirring and gave a slight nod, not unkind, but without ceremony. "How's it feel?" Jack flexed his fingers. They ached, but they moved. His feet still tingled, but sensation hadn't left them. He sat up slowly, like I was buried in a library. Pete gave a rare smile, just at the corner of his mouth. Better a library than a grave. The words struck Jack harder than he expected. It wasn't just a joke. It was a philosophy. Newspapers weren't scraps, weren't trash blowing down alleys. In the right hands, they were armor, insulation, survival. Pete's hands moved with a kind of reverence as he layered them, like a craftsman working wood or stone. Jack began to understand. Paper wasn't a symbol of poverty here. It was proof of knowledge, of humility before the elements. Pete tossed him a fresh sheet. "Your turn. Show me how you'd wrap a man to keep him alive tonight." Jack hesitated. His hands still trembled from the cold. But he spread the sheet across his knees and began to fold as he'd seen Pete do. His motions were clumsy, corners uneven, overlaps careless. Pete watched silently, letting him finish. When Jack finally looked up, Pete didn't scold. He simply took the sheet back, unfolded it, and showed him again. Slower this time. He overlapped the edges, just so, pressing one crease against another until no gap remained. "Cold doesn't forgive gaps," Pete said softly. "Doesn't matter how small, that's how it gets in. Through pride, through laziness, through thinking close enough is good enough. Paper's honest, you respect it, it keeps you warm. You rush it, you freeze." Jack tried again, this time more careful. He forced his hands to steady, aligning each edge, smoothing each crease. Pete nodded once when he finished, the kind of nod a carpenter gives an apprentice who has finally learned to measure straight. "Not bad," Pete said. "Keep practicing. Hands remember what the mind forgets." The lesson settled deep. Jack realized this wasn't just about paper. It was about life since the crash, since everything had been stripped away. Pride, shortcuts, thinking you could bluff your way through, all of it collapsed under the cold. Only humility, patience, and the willingness to learn kept a man alive. Pete leaned back against the wall, his breath misting faintly. "You've got carpenter's hands," he observed. Jack blinked. "Used to work in a bank." Pete's eyes narrowed slightly, as though testing the truth of the statement. Jack hurried to explain. "Ledgers, balances, numbers all day. Thought I had the world figured out until it collapsed." Pete gave a low hum, not judgmental, just matter of fact. Then you'll learn faster. Precision is the same, whether it's wood, numbers, or paper. Respect the pattern. Don't cut corners. Jack wanted to ask more about who Pete was before the rails, about what he had lost. But something in Pete's expression held him back. The man carried history in the lines of his face, but it wasn't offered freely. For now, paper was the lesson, and Jack sensed that was enough. The train jolted suddenly, the rhythm shifting as it entered hilly terrain. Snow spilled in through the cracks, but their corner shelter held. Jack found himself watching Pete, not just as a rescuer, but as a teacher. Every motion had purpose, checking seams, adjusting folds, conserving energy. He realized he was being shown something bigger than survival. He was being invited into a craft, a tradition of knowledge passed from rider to rider. As the day wore on, Pete taught him more refinements: how to double layer vulnerable joints, how to tuck paper under armpits and behind knees where heat escaped fastest, how to create a breathing flap near the mouth to keep moisture from soaking the insulation. Each detail mattered. Each detail could mean the difference between seeing dawn or not. Jack practiced until his fingers cramped, until he could almost do it without looking. Pete corrected him with the patience of someone who had made the same mistakes once himself. There was no mockery, no arrogance, just a quiet insistence that survival demanded discipline. Finally, when the last adjustments were made, Pete leaned back and regarded him with steady eyes. "You'll live through another storm now," he said. "Maybe even on your own." Jack felt something stir inside him. Not pride, exactly, but dignity. The cold hadn't beaten him, not entirely. He had learned, and learning meant he could teach someday. That thought warmed him almost as much as the paper. The train rocked them deeper into the plains, the storm still swirling outside, but inside the boxcar there was order. Layers of paper, layers of knowledge, layers of trust. Jack realized he had entered a strange new apprenticeship, one not marked by paychecks or promotions, but by survival itself. That night, as he settled into his newspaper cocoon, he thought about the name the writers had given Pete, Newspaper Pete. It wasn't just a nickname. It was a legacy, a man who had taken scraps of the world and turned them into life, a man who passed that gift on to others without asking for anything in return. Paper, not pride. That was the lesson, and Jack, shivering but alive, resolved he would never forget it. The rhythm of the train lulled them through the night, but it wasn't a restful lullaby. Each jolt of the wheels against the frozen rails was a reminder that they were riding inside a steel coffin carried by chance. The cold crept in at every seam, whispering of the storm that had not yet finished with them. By morning, the first flakes drifted in through the cracks, light at first, like a dusting of flour, but soon the flakes grew heavier, driven sideways by a wind that keened across the plains like some old spirit. Jack pressed his hand against the thin wood of the boxcar wall and felt it vibrate with the force of the gusts. Pete was already awake, scanning their shelter with practiced eyes. "Storm's building," he muttered, his voice low but certain. Thomas, who had been adjusting the newspaper layers on his arms, glanced up. "Barometer's falling fast," he said, flexing his left wrist with a grimace. "I can feel it in the break. Never healed right." Pete's eyes darkened at the thought of his son carrying such scars from years apart. He reached over and gently touched Thomas's wrist, just for a moment. Then he pulled back his voice turning brisk. All right, we prepare, reinforce everything. No gaps, no weak spots. The storm's going to test us. Jack watched father and son move together. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Thomas mirrored Pete's actions as they pressed paper into seams, layered corners, and secured every flap with bits of cord and twine scavenged from earlier towns. Jack joined them, following their lead, and soon the three of them moved as one, a crew, not just passengers. The snow thickened, hissing against the walls of the car, sifting through even the smallest cracks. Drifts began forming inside, pale ghosts creeping across the wooden floor. Jack brushed them away, but knew it was futile. The storm would find every opening. The key wasn't to stop it, it was to outlast it, Pete explained as they worked. Always assume the storm's stronger than you. Don't fight it. Adapt. Reinforce what you can, conserve what you have, and let time do the rest. Thomas grinned faintly, despite the cold. Sounds just like you in the workshop, Pa. Measure twice, cut once. Pete chuckled, the sound soft, but full of memory. Same principle. Weather doesn't forgive sloppy work any more than wood does. As they finished reinforcing the shelter, Jack noticed something shift in Thomas. The boy's hands moved with growing confidence. He wasn't just following instructions anymore. He was anticipating them, adjusting angles, overlapping layers, suggesting small improvements. Pete noticed too, though he didn't say it aloud. Instead, he let Thomas teach him a new knot he'd learned from another rider, a loop that tightened with tension. Picked that up in Montana, Thomas explained proudly. Old Arctic explorer showed me. Said he'd used it to lash tents in blizzards. Pete tested the knot, tugging hard. It held. He gave a single approving nod. Good. You keep that one. Could save lives. The approval warmed Thomas more than any fire. Jack felt it too. This passing of knowledge, this exchange of respect. Survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about learning, teaching, sharing. That was the hidden currency of the rails. By afternoon, the storm struck in full. The train shuddered as drifts piled against the wheels. Snow blasted through the cracks and icy streams, coating everything in white dust. The temperature dropped so sharply, Jack could feel the air seeping into his bones. His breath crystallized instantly. Tiny shards of ice clinging to his scarf. This is bad, he whispered, unable to keep the fear from his voice. Pete glanced at him steadily. Bad doesn't matter. What matters is the plan. What's the plan? Jack asked, trying to steady his voice. Pete's reply was calm, almost gentle. Shelter in place. Reinforce insulation, rotate body heat, stretch rations. We wait it out. 3 days, maybe 4 if we're careful. Thomas looked at him with clear, steady eyes. And if the train stays stranded longer, then we adapt again, Pete said simply. Always have a backup. Always. The words weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. Jack realized this was Pete's true strength. Not bravado, not defiance, but a quiet refusal to surrender. They worked quickly to establish their storm protocol. Pete showed them how to rotate sleeping positions. 1 man in the middle, 2 on the outside, switching every 2 hours so no one froze in the outer layer. They inventoried the food, rationing it down to mouthfuls that would keep their energy steady without burning through supplies. Jack marveled at the precision. Even now, with death pressing against the walls, there was method, order, almost a strange kind of peace. Hours dragged. The train slowed, then stopped completely. The sudden silence after hours of clattering wheels was unsettling, like the world itself had paused. Snow battered the boxcar, wind howling like an animal trying to break in. Jack huddled in the shelter, pressed between Pete and Thomas, their combined heat creating a fragile cocoon. He thought about the men and women scattered across the country, each facing storms of their own, each improvising with scraps of paper, rope, and willpower. He thought about how small they were, how fragile, and yet, in that fragile space, something resilient was born. Thomas's voice broke the silence. If we get stranded too long, what about the other riders? Some of them won't know what to do. Pete hesitated. His eyes flickered toward the door, toward the storm outside. Finally, he shook his head. Not in this. Storm like this'll swallow a man whole. We wait. When it eases, we check. Until then, we stay alive. Jack understood the harshness of it. Survival wasn't kindness. It wasn't cruelty either. It was clarity. Night came, and the storm howled louder than before, slamming against the steel walls until the boxcar shuddered. Snow sifted through cracks in steady streams. Their breath froze on the edges of their scarves, turning to tiny icicles. The cold pressed in, probing, searching. In the darkness, huddled tight, Jack realized the truth of Pete's philosophy. Survival wasn't about defeating the storm. It was about respecting it, preparing, adapting, enduring, and doing it together. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind scream like a living thing outside, and thought, this is the lesson. Paper, not pride. Shelter, not bravado. Patience, not panic. And with that thought, he drifted into uneasy sleep, warmed not just by body heat, but by the knowledge that he wasn't alone. The storm finally wrestled the train to a standstill. One moment the wheels still hummed beneath them. The next there was only the hiss of wind and the hollow creak of frozen steel. Silence can be loud in winter, the kind that fills your ears until you hear your own heartbeat. Slow and deliberate, choosing to go on. Now we wait, Pete said softly, checking the old watch he carried like a compass to steadier years. 2 hours. Then we decide. Outside, the world was erased. The observation slit showed only a churning white, as if the car hung suspended in cloud. Inside, the shelter's canvas breathed with them, a gentle rise and fall, the smallest rhythm of life, holding its own against the weather's hard fist. They rotated places, just as Pete had taught, one in the middle, two flanking, changing every 2 hours. Body heat made a small republic under the canvas, fragile, stubborn, enough. Thomas asked the question that had been knocking at the door of their thoughts. What about the other riders? Pete's eyes paused on the seam he was reinforcing. If we go now, this storm takes us, he said, not unkindly. When the wind eases, we check the next cars. Until then, we keep our fire lit. He tapped the layers at Jack's chest. The paper furnace, the quiet miracle of trapped air. We keep this burning. Time thinned and thickened by turns. The wind screamed and sometimes fell into a low groan, like a tired giant shifting in sleep. Jack measured it by touch, the stiffening of his scarf, the way frost crept into the edge of the canvas and rhymed the knot Pete had tied hours earlier. He let his breathing settle into the train's slow creak, and when fear tried to climb up his spine, like cold water, he focused on practical things. The next ration, the next rotation, the steady warmth of another human being pressed close in the dark. When the gale finally blinked, just a breath, just a moment, Pete felt it first, his head tilted, a carpenter listening for a floor joist's whisper. "That's our window," he murmured. "Small, but it's ours." They prepared as if for surgery, extra paper to hands and feet, faces wrapped until only thin, dark eye slits remained, a cord tied between their waists, a lifeline and a promise. Pete's tool warmed against his chest, ready to break ice from the next car's door track. 15 feet, he told Jack. Feels like a mile out there. Keep to the steel. If the wind blinds you, stop. I'll find you. Thomas wanted to go. The word was in his posture before it reached his lips. Pete shook his head. You keep the shelter alive. That's the job that saves all of us. Thomas swallowed his argument and nodded once. Trust was its own form of heat. The door slid an inch, then another, and winter came for them with open hands. The cold hit like a blow. Clean, absolute. The kind of cold that erases thought if you let it. They moved into it sideways, like men shouldering through a crowd. Snow rose to mid-thigh, where drifts piled against the wheels. The wind shoved and clawed. The cord between them tightened, slackened, tightened again. The simplest language of survival. I'm here. I'm here. At the next car, Pete worked the iced track with his tool until the door surrendered with a groan. Anybody riding? He called into the dark. A thin voice answered from the far corner. Help, please. Two shapes resolved. A young man, a younger woman, bundled in summer's idea of winter. Light coats, no gloves. City shoes gone rigid with ice. Their lips were the wrong color, and their hands moved like slow machines. Newlyweds, the young man managed through chattering teeth. Kansas City, Springfield, words wavered and blew away. Talk later, Pete said, already cutting away wet cloth, already wrapping paper in tight overlaps, already binding with strips torn from his own inner layer. Core first, hands later. His voice was quiet and exact. We're going to stand you up now. 15 feet, you walk, or we lose time. They moved as a cluster, bodies braced together against the wind. Twice the woman's knees melted under her. Twice Pete kept her moving with a grip that brooked no argument. Jack spoke in a low, steady murmur. Nothing fancy, only the next step, and the next, and the word almost like a lantern. When the shelter door breathed them back in, the cold let go all at once and left them shaking with the memory of it. Center position, Pete ordered gently. Press close. Thomas was already sliding aside, making room without a word. The young couple vanished into their warmth like stones into water. Pete melted a cup of clean snow against his own ribs, slow and careful. Added a pinch of dried meat powder from a small oiled packet, and lifted the broth to the husband's mouth. Small sips, let your body keep pace. The woman's eyes were glassy and far away. Frost had sketched red warning patches across the bridge of her nose and the high curve of her cheeks. Closer, Pete said, and Jack and Thomas obeyed, enclosing her between them until the shiver turned from violent to productive, from wildfire to steady stove. Robert, the young man breathed when his voice returned. She's Emma. Names were a kind of heat, too. They settled into the shelter's corners. One more rotation, one more life added to the small republic of breath. They portioned food with the same seriousness as the knot on the door flap. Sally's packets, fat rich, bite size, chosen to be chewable. When Rock Hard made the rounds, no one lingered too long on their portion, and no one hurried either. Between bites, Thomas demonstrated the newspaper overlap on Emma's wrist. Robert watched as if the pattern could save him, and it could. Most people think weight equals warmth, Pete said, eyes on the layers. It's the air that saves you, air that can't move. Paper traps it better than pride. Outside, the storm shouldered past, one long gust at a time. Inside, language gathered again. Robert told them the road they'd planned to take, the ticket they couldn't afford, the winter they didn't respect until it taught them its name. Emma, voice small, said, I didn't know it could be so fast. Pete nodded. Cold is not a thief. It's a debt collector. The wind faltered to a tired moan. Pete listened again, then looked toward the cracked seam that served as their window on the world. We've got to see about the others, Jack said, repeating his earlier thought. But now the conditions agreed. Thomas, Pete said, you hold this ground. Keep them warm. If the wind wakes up mean again, seal in and wait for us. Thomas's eyes flicked to the couple, then back to his father. Aye. It was not a sailor's eye, it was a son's. They rapped again, doubled the cord, packed small rations to leave behind, and stepped once more into the pale, hard world. Car by car, as if walking a street of shut doors, they knocked. 2 were empty. In a third, an old man sat like a thawed statue, hands blackening at the edges, breath shallow and thin. Too far gone to drag through this, Pete said. Sorrow threaded through his calm. They built a pocket shelter where he sat. Canvas, paper, rope, a tiny tent of mercy, and left heat and food and the instructions a man tries to follow when he comes back. Further on, 2 riders had the bones of a plan, but not the skin. Pete stitched their corners shut with new rope and old wisdom, left a packet of Sally's food, 2 bites every hour, slow is safe, and moved on. In the last car they planned to enter, a small company of men with decent gear looked up in surprise. Newspaper, Pete? One blurted, as if a rumor had stepped through the door. They shared a tin of coffee, fragile luxury, heat in a cup, and they blessed its sting all the way back through the drifts. When the shelter swallowed them again, Thomas had Emma smiling faintly, and Robert tying a proper binding knot with sore, clumsy fingers. Good, Pete said. One word, whole library. Evening softened around them. The wind, worked to dullness, spent itself across the flats. Cold still pressed in. It always would. But without the gale's claws, their cocoon held steady. They ate in small, thoughtful silences, Emma said. I thought newspaper was trash. Thomas lifted a layer so she could see the tiny, shining spaces. It's air, he said, and air is gold. They took watches. Jack lay listening to the boxcar's old bones settle, the faint tick and sigh of cold metal thinking its way through the night. When his turn came to the observation slit, the sky had opened to a sea of stars. Moonlight limned a landscape remade, drifts like frozen waves, the train half buried and eerily still, a cathedral of cold light. Pete came to stand beside him, eyes reflecting the same quiet astonishment. After a blizzard, he said, almost to himself, the world looks like it remembers how to be simple. They spoke then of small futures, because small futures are the kind you can hold. A telegram, a name spoken across a wire, a workshop that might still smell of cedar. Jack listened, and somewhere beneath his ribs, a knot he hadn't noticed began to loosen. Dawn rose sharp as glass, sun on snow, shadows blue as ink. The crew moved along the line, tiny figures against the vast bright. Plow will come, Pete said. The near certainty of men who make maps in their heads from sound and timing and long miles. The whistle that reached them an hour later was more felt than heard, the answer to a patient prayer. Before the plow returned on their track, they made one last round. Quick checks, quick words, quick fixes. The old man in the corner blinked them back to focus and squeezed Jack's hand with surprising strength. In two other cars, men reported holding, a winter verb that means we're alive for now. It would do. Back in their own car, Thomas had Robert and Emma practicing rapid teardown, how to vanish a shelter in under a minute without losing a knot or a strip of paper. The rider who packs fastest lives longest, he said, the teacher's tone startling and right in his young mouth. Metal shuddered. The train leaned and grunted and found its legs. We're moving, Emma breathed, half laugh, half prayer. Pete nodded once. A long way yet, he said. But his eyes softened. They would reach towns with names they could finally say without flinching. There would be bulls and water stops and more nights like this. There would be telegram forms and a bluff above the river, a cave-hollow jungle where winter learned to blink first. But for now, the car rolled forward, and 5 people who should not have lived through that night were alive, warm enough, and wiser by several lives' worth of weather. The storm had stranded them. It had also taught them paper instead of pride, method instead of panic, and together, always together, against the cold that has no face and no mercy, but can be outlasted. The train groaned but moved on, wheels grinding slowly against rails packed with snow. Progress was measured not in miles, but in breaths, in the fragile promise that the line eastward still had life in it. Inside their car, the air had warmed to something human. 5 people pressed close, not simply for heat now, but for the shared comfort that comes when strangers discover they are no longer strangers. Emma stirred first. She blinked at the golden stripes of sunlight seeping through cracks in the wooden wall. For a moment, she looked lost, her lips parting as if to ask where she was. Then memory returned, and she whispered, "We survived." Robert, her husband, squeezed her hand. His face still carried the shadow of cold that had almost taken him, but his eyes were alive again. "Because of them," he said softly, nodding toward Pete, Jack, and Thomas. "They knew what we didn't." Pete waved the words away, as though brushing frost from his coat. "Knowledge is meant to be passed," he said. "That's all this is." But Thomas leaned forward, eager to make the lesson stick. He held up a strip of old newspaper. "See this?" He tore it carefully into a fresh layer, wrapping Emma's wrist with patient precision. "It's not the weight that saves you, it's the air. Tiny pockets of air, trapped where the cold can't move. Feels flimsy, but it's worth more than wool when the wind comes hard." Emma flexed her fingers and stared at the paper like it was spun silver. "I thought newspaper was trash," she admitted. "Out here," Thomas said gently, "trash keeps you alive." Pete's eyes softened as he watched his son. The boy's voice carried his mother's tone when she explained things, calm and steady, never mocking. Thomas had learned the trick of teaching not with superiority, but with solidarity. "We do this together, you and I, so you'll remember next time." They ate a rationed breakfast, 5 equal shares. Sally's food never looked like much, but each bite was dense with the science of survival. High fat that wouldn't freeze solid, bits of meat that dissolved into energy before the cold could steal it, nut meal that lingered like an ember in the body's furnace. Robert shook his head in disbelief. We brought sandwiches, he admitted, and by the second hour they were like bricks. Couldn't even bite them. Sandwiches are for summer trains, Pete said, his tone neither cruel nor kind, simply factual. Winter demands its own menu. You'll learn. Jack found himself watching Thomas more than the couple. There was a steadiness in the boy, a confidence born not from age, but from trial. He had crossed half a continent on whispers and rumor, chasing the shape of a father he barely remembered. Now, in this boxcar, he moved with the authority of someone who had survived lessons written in snow and hunger. When the train slowed to a halt again, they all felt the shift. The air changed first. The deep sigh of pistons, the slackening of steel tension, then silence pressed in once more. Pete rose to the observation slit, narrowing his eyes at the light. More drifts, he said. We'll be here a while. Jack looked uneasy. What if it's another full stop? Then we repeat the ritual, Pete replied, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. Reinforce the shelter, rotate, ration, knowledge first, panic never. It struck Jack how Pete always returned to the same sequence of steps, like a carpenter checking a beam or a sailor adjusting sails. Rituals, practiced responses, kept fear at bay. They didn't leave space for chaos to spill in. When the wind lulled again, Pete decided, we check on the others. His tone left no room for debate. He tied the cord once more around his waist, passing the other end to Jack. 15 feet to the next door. Same as before. We carry rations, layers, what we can spare. Not everyone knows what we know. Thomas opened his mouth to volunteer, but Pete laid a firm hand on his shoulder. Not yet. You keep Robert and Emma safe. Keep the fire lit. Jack caught the flicker in Thomas's eyes. Half frustration, half respect. The boy wanted to prove himself, but he also understood the heavier weight of being entrusted with others' survival. So he nodded, slow and serious. They stepped into the storm's remains. The air still cut like glass, but the wind had slackened to something survivable. One car, then another. Two stood empty, echoing with snow sifted in through warped boards. In the third, they found the old man huddled in shadow, frostbite blackening his fingers. His pulse was faint, but stubborn. Jack crouched. Can we move him? Pete shook his head. Not without killing him. We build around him. So they worked quickly, creating a corner cocoon from layers of paper and spare cloth, sealing seams, tucking rations by his side. Pete leaned close to the old man's ear. Stay still. Bite small pieces. The storm will pass. It was as much a prayer as an instruction. In another car, two riders had thrown together a poor shelter with gaps that bled heat. Pete reinforced it with extra paper, Jack with strips of cloth, then left them food and a few muttered lessons. Air saves more lives than fire, Pete told them, repeating the mantra. The men nodded, eyes wide, with the kind of gratitude that holds no words. The last car they checked surprised them. 4 men sat in relative comfort, their corner shelter neat and layered, supplies stacked carefully. One looked up in disbelief. Your newspaper, Pete? The name traveled faster than the man himself. Pete only shrugged, just passing on what I learned. But the riders pressed hot coffee into their hands. Precious luxury, dark and steaming, a miracle in the frozen world. The warmth ran through Jack's veins like light. For a moment, the storm outside seemed only a rumor. On the way back, Pete said quietly, "Community, that's what winter teaches. Folks think it's every man for himself, but survival spreads best when shared." When they returned, Thomas had the couple smiling faintly, their hands busy learning knots and folds of the paper method. Pete looked at the scene and allowed himself the smallest smile. "Good thinking," he told his son. Evening fell slow. The wind died to an occasional sigh. Inside, the shelter glowed with body heat and the soft rhythm of quiet voices. They ate again, small portions stretched thinner now, but shared without resentment. Jack lay in the dark, listening. The sound was not silence. It was layers of breath, the scrape of cloth, the faint shift of paper under weight. He realized these were the true rituals of winter survival. Not just the techniques, but the simple presence of others who refused to let the cold have the final word. And outside, unseen but certain, the plow train was on its way. Night settled like a blanket, pulled tight over iron and ice. Inside the shelter, 5 bodies breathed in a slow, steady rhythm. Outside, the world hissed with tiny crystals sliding across snow. Jack took the first watch, hands tucked into layers, eyes at the small observation slit where moonlight silvered the drifts. The storm had blown itself empty. What remained was stillness, and a cold so clean it seemed to ring. Pete eased up beside him after a while, sleep refusing to come. "Couldn't settle," he murmured, voice low, protective of the quiet. "Mine's too full." Jack nodded. He knew that feeling now. How the rails filled a man with movement, even at rest. "Beautiful out there," he whispered, "like the world has been wiped clean." "Blizzards do that," Pete said. "Wipe and leave. Gives you the feeling you might start over. If you're lucky." They stood together without speaking, the way men do when words would only push the moment away. Frost sparkled on the sill. A fox, or maybe a hungry dog, drifted into view, paused to study the still boxcar, then trotted on, black against the moon-white crust. Pete glanced back toward the shelter. Thomas slept between Robert and Emma, the 3 of them stacked into warmth like a small stove. "Still can't believe it," he said softly. 3 years of chasing rumors, and then he falls through a door into my life. "Maybe the rails decided you'd paid your dues," Jack said. Pete huffed a quiet laugh. "Rails don't keep accounts. We do. That's the trick." He clapped Jack's shoulder once and returned to rest. Jack watched the sky tilt, constellations sliding toward the river of morning. At the far end of the train, a lantern bobbed and went still. The crew would be taking stock, measuring drifts, counting minutes. He pictured the engineer's face, cracked lips, rhymed lashes, doing the mental math of steel and snow. Dawn arrived gently, no fanfare, just a slow lifting of color. The cold deepened with the light, the way it sometimes does, as though night had merely been holding its breath. The sun glazed the world to diamond. Jack could see layers now, wind-hardened crust, scalloped ridges, a cornice draped like frozen surf against the car. They would not move without help. "Crew's moving," he murmured. Pete was up instantly, with winter riders waking as a switch, not a slide. He joined Jack at the slit. "Plow's coming," he said. "They'll clear west to open the main, then swing back and give us an eastbound path." Thomas roused, careful not to jostle the couple. Emma blinked into the brightness and smiled, weak but genuine. I thought I'd never be warm again, she said. You will be, Pete answered, already in the day's rhythm. Warm and wiser, they ate small portions, measured even, respectful of the arithmetic that kept them alive. Thomas explained the newspaper layers again, this time like a teacher reviewing a lesson before a test. Robert repeated the steps back, fumbling slightly over the overlap pattern. Emma corrected him with a quiet grin. Jack almost smiled. The method had moved from rescue to ritual. That was how knowledge held. By mid-morning, the faint shudder of distant engines reached them, a vibration more than a sound. Then the plow appeared, a wedge of iron driven by 2 locomotives, throwing glittering walls to either side as it tore a channel through the drifts. Pete watched, absorbed. V-plow, he said. Rotary does it cleaner, but this is cheaper, faster to field. Brute force and patience. The plow thundered past on the westbound track, carving an escape for trains behind it. A long interval, then silence again. Snow settled, little avalanches whispering down the banked sides of the trench. The sun climbed. Their breath made small clouds. The day held. They'll loop back, Pete said. Clear our way. Before the return, he and Jack made a quick round to check the riders they'd helped the day before. The cold bit hard the moment they opened their door. No wind now, which made it deceiving. The kind of cold that sneaks under collars and works on exposed skin in minutes. They moved fast and sure, tied to each other by rope again, stepping in their previous footprints where they could. The old man was awake, eyes cloudy but focused. The black on his fingers looked worse in daylight, but he was alive and knew it. Pete pressed a ration into his palm and guided the hand down to his chest. Keep this close, he said. Warm it before you eat. The man nodded. A whisper, bless you, froze in the air between them. The pair, with the leaky shelter, had improved it exactly as instructed. Pete made 2 quick corrections and left them another strip of oilcloth. In the better prepared car, the men greeted them with hoarse cheers and passed a dented tin cup steaming with coffee. Jack held it between both hands, not for the drink alone, but for the weight and heat. Community served hot. They traded a few words, cargo guesses, yard gossip, a rumor of jobs upriver, then moved on. Back at their car, Thomas had Robert and Emma practicing the knot that seals a layer without crushing it. He corrected gently, the same way Pete had corrected him. Wrist first, he said. Elbow second. Joints are where gaps are born. Joints are where gaps are born, Emma repeated, filing it away. A whistle, 3 short blasts, cut through the afternoon. Pete's head came up. Prepare to move. They broke down the corner shelter quickly, each man grabbing familiar tasks. Canvas folded tight, cloth strips coiled, not wadded, newspapers sorted, dry to the waterproof pouch, damp to the discard stack. Nothing clattered, nothing dragged. A good pack job meant speed later, and speed later could mean life. Thomas demonstrated for Robert and Emma how to roll layers for quick redeploy. Fast is smooth, he said. Smooth is warm. Outside, the plow returned on the eastbound track, the wedge biting into the drifts with a scream and a shower of powdered light. The trench it left looked like a hallway to somewhere else, a promise line. Their train shuddered as if waking. Steel pinged, brakes released with a sigh. We're moving, Emma breathed, hands pressed together. Cautious now, Pete said. Not to dampen joy, but to keep it from running. Plows open the way. Doesn't mean the way stays open. The wheels turned, slowly at first, Then, with growing confidence, as the locomotive felt its path, through the slit, the world slid past in white and shadow. A tree line, a fence wearing a hood of snow, a drift split like a cake. Inside, they reassembled their microclimate for travel. No longer the full cocoon, but layered perches that shared heat without throttling movement. Pete recalculated rations aloud, adjusting for the rescue. No one complained. Numbers spoken calmly, reassure like a steady hand. Hours ticked by in the locomotive's heartbeat. Pete marked progress on his mental map. Water towers, the curve that means a creek, the long straight where the rails sing different. Jefferson City by night, he said. If we hold? Jack watched Thomas watch his father. Recognition lived in the boy's face. This was who Pete was at his core. A man who took measure, made a plan, and lived inside method when others scattered. It occurred to Jack that this steadiness, the refusal to be pushed by weather or fear, had probably saved more lives than the paper trick ever had. When the sun folded into the horizon, the cold sharpened again. Inside, they loosened knots, slightly to keep blood moving, then retightened. Rituals, always rituals. Jack felt the rhythm in his bones now. Seal and check, eat and move, rest and watch. He had arrived on the winter rails as a man rushing to fall apart. Now each repeated act stitched him back together. Close to midnight, the train slowed for a yard. Not St. Louis yet, not even the larger stops, just a water and coal pause in a river of darkness. Bulls would sweep, lanterns probing. They stayed still and quiet as light drifted by. A silent shoal slipping past a prow. When the wheels gripped again, hope rose. Emma squeezed Robert's fingers. Thomas slipped them an extra twist of cloth cut into wrist warmers. Jack made a final pass through everyone's layers, tucking, smoothing, sealing. Pete leaned at the slit, reading the night the way sailors read wind. Hold your warmth, he said, almost to himself. Morning's coming, and it did, right on time, thin and blue and clear, and with it, the Mississippi's far glitter, a promise braided through steel. They weren't at St. Louis yet, not quite, but the rails were pointed there, and the path was open. The plow had done its work, the crew had done theirs, and inside a single wooden box, 5 people had practiced the rituals that make survival feel like a craft you can learn, not a lottery you win. Pete tapped the wall once, a carpenter's habit he'd never shaken. We ride on, he said. The train obliged. The day opened, and the world, scraped clean by storm and iron, seemed to say, try again. The rails hummed low and steady under frost, a metal heartbeat carrying them east. Sometime after midnight, the moon thinned behind a veil, and the world slipped into that quiet hour when even winter seems to rest. Inside the boxcar, their shelter breathed warmth like a small animal. Outside, the corridor of snow the plow had carved held firm. Next stop, Jefferson City, Pete said, not guessing but knowing, his ear tuned to the long curve, the short grade, the particular way the wheels sang over bridge steel. Thomas sat up without a word, already winding cloth strips, already checking knots. Robert and Emma followed his motions. Concentration, clearing the last shadows from their faces. We'll get you off close, Pete told them. Coal bunker side, fewer bulls, 10 miles north to your folks' place. Doable by daylight if you keep moving and keep covered. Emma nodded, the kind of nod that lifts from the chest. We'll make it. They ate small and smart, tiny squares of hard cheese, a spoon of nut paste, 2 thin chips of dried meat softened in the mouth. Every bite had a job. While they ate, Thomas reviewed the drill one last time. Layer order: wrist, elbow, shoulder, knee first, then ankle. Overlap 3 fingers. Feel for gaps. Gaps are thieves. Gaps are thieves, Robert repeated, and smiled despite himself. The engine eased back, brakes sighing. The yard lamps of Jefferson City opened like a string of low yellow moons beyond the slats. Bulls would be near the depot and switching tower. Pete had his place, a blind slice along the coal pile where the patrol route left a seam. When I say, he murmured, door, drop, roll, up and gone. East to the trees, no running on cinders. Black ice, looks like gravel. He looked each of them in the eye, the way men do when they mean to send someone home alive. You two made it through a storm most don't. Don't get careless now. The car bumped, couplers clanked, and then the speed fell to a walk. Pete slid the door a handspan, tested the air, then slid it wider. A bar of cold slipped in and laid itself along their cheeks. He counted under his breath, 5, 4, 3, now. They moved like a single thought. Jack hit the ground in snow, let his knees go soft, rolled and came up facing the dark line of trees. The couple landed behind him, bundled and sure. Thomas dropped last, turned, and pulled the door to. The train slid on, unaware it had shed pieces of fate. They trotted for the cover of cottonwoods and hedge. Under the branches, the snow was thinner, and the night pressed close in a way that felt like protection rather than threat. Jack's breath sounded loud. He swallowed it back. Pete lifted a gloved hand. Halt, and listened. Yard sounds. Distant. A bull's throat clearing. A coupler knocked into place. Steam coughing from an idle engine. No shout. No lantern coming. Good, Pete said softly. We say our piece here. They formed a small circle that made its own light. Pete unrolled a square of oilcloth, revealed 2 last comforts, a heel of bread wrapped in paper and a hard candy each. Sugar for the road, he said, for thinking clear when you're tired. Emma blinked fast, then laughed at herself. Sorry, she said. It's just, I didn't expect kindness to weigh so much. It weighs exactly enough, Pete answered. He reviewed the route to the farm. Fence line, creek bend, the little plank bridge that would groan under their feet. But hold, if the wind comes up, cover your mouths. If your toes go numb, don't wait. Stop, move, add, he said, tapping his own boot where newspaper lived between sock and leather. You know how now. Robert shook Pete's hand first, then Jack's, then Thomas's. His grip had strength back in it. We'll pass it on, he said. That's the rule, right? That's the rule, Thomas echoed. Emma hugged each of them, quick and fierce. Thank you for the second chance, she whispered. We won't waste it. They watched the couple step into the dark and settle into a steady walk, the way riders do when they have a destination and enough knowledge to reach it. Their shapes thinned to brush, and then to nothing. For a long, quiet beat, no one spoke. Back to the train, Pete said gently. St. Louis is waiting. They shadowed the yard edge until the line of cars reappeared, brushed with frost and coal smoke. The train was taking water. A bull's lantern washed past 2 cars down. They froze to wood and shadow, then flowed forward again. At their boxcar, Pete's hand found the scar he'd left in the ice along the sill, levered the door, and they slipped into their familiar dim. The ritual returned like muscle memory. Canvas up, corner sealed, breath turning to a faint mist as the shelter held. We lost weight and kept warmth, Jack said, counting rations, recalculating for 3. Sally's careful bundles now looked generous. We're all right. More than all right, Pete said, easing down at last. We did the work. They did too. The train took the hint and moved, slow at first, then with the sure gather of steel that knows where it's going. Jefferson City fell behind, lamps shrinking to wavering stars. The night grew clean again. The river's great curve waited somewhere ahead, like a line in a ledger. They didn't talk much. No need. Fatigue ran through the 3 of them, like a quiet river, but not the dragging kind, the satisfied kind that follows good labor, cleanly done. Jack took first watch. Thomas, in the middle slot of their 3-person bind, dropped into a sleep so deep his breath hardly moved the scarf. Pete rested, with eyes half open, the way men rest when history has shifted under their feet and they're afraid it might shift back. Hours later, Jack felt the grade change, the smallest pressure along the ear, the way a boat reads a river's shallows. He stirred Pete with 2 fingers. Bridge soon, he whispered. Soon, Pete murmured. Then the yards, then the bluff. The train coasted briefly, then gripped. Dawn arrived like a held breath released. Gray first, and then a soft wash of pale gold. They broke shelter and packed as the light strengthened, everything going where it belonged. Newspapers dry side inward, cloth strips coiled, knots facing out for quick hands. Pete checked their layers one by one, more habit than doubt. We enter on the move and leave on the move, he said. In and out without waking any bears. City outlines gathered from steam and smoke. Faint at first, and then distinct. Stacks staining the morning, a thin pillar from a boiler room, the lacework of a bridge shivering in the cold. The Mississippi showed a skin of skim ice in the slack water near shore. Out in the main channel, black current flexed its shoulders and kept the world honest. Thomas eased up beside the slit, smile trying its way across his face. Been a long time, he said. Long enough, Pete answered. He tapped the wall once, then again. A private rhythm, carpentry turned superstition. We're not across yet. The approach felt both quick and endless, as yard approaches always do, turnouts and crossovers, a rattle here, a long sigh there. The car coupler's conversation passed along a chain of iron. Bulls would be thick, though less mean than some places. Cold makes even hard men practical. Jump point? Jack asked. East side, behind the coal bunker, Thomas replied, and Pete nodded. The test passed both ways. Blind spot in the patrol loop. Same place as last time. Good, Pete said. We take it slow, then fast. The brakes spoke, metal on metal, and the cars settled as if leaning into their own weight. The world out the slit filled with rail geometry, switch stands, dwarf signals, a yard goat nosing at a cut of boxcars. Through it all, a path like a seam, opened and closed with each slow lurch. Ready, Pete said. Door, drop, roll, east to trees. Count to 20 before you look back. The door side open, cold poured in, but not the kind that steals. It was the kind that wakes. They rode the speed down through their feet, then stepped off the moving earth, like men stepping off a porch, snow cushioned. Rolls took the bite. They were up at once, and gone toward the timber. 3 shadows stitched to one another by trust and repetition. The shouting they expected didn't come. Maybe the bulls were busy with a louder catch. Maybe luck smiled. Maybe the rails had decided their account was even for now. They reached the trees and let their breath come. St. Louis lay east, a mile of creek, a slope, then a path worn by 100 winter boots to the bluff where Iron Mike kept the big cave warm. Almost there, Thomas said, quiet and shining. Almost, Pete agreed. First things first, telegraph. Jack smiled into his scarf. He could see it, the stuttering wire, the clerk's pencil, the words Alice would unfold with shaking hands. Found Thomas. Stop together. Stop safe. Stop. In a winter that had taken so much. A sentence like a small sun. They moved along the wood's edge, staying low, staying smart. Snow whispered underfoot. The city woke in little clinks and puffs ahead of them. When they reached the slope, the river opened wide and bright, a cold sheet with a warm promise beyond it. Keep your feet, Pete said. But he was smiling too now. The line of worry around his mouth eased for the first time in years. They kept their feet, they kept their line, and the path to the bluff, hard packed by others who knew this winter road, welcomed them as if it had been waiting all along. The bluff rose slow and steady above the frozen river, its face carved by decades of wind and water into shelves and hollows. From the trees below, it looked like the edge of another world, and in some ways, it was. Men on the rails whispered about it like a church. Iron Mike's Place, they called it. Not just a hobo jungle, not just a fire in a clearing, a fortress against the winter. The three of them, Pete, Jack, and Thomas, climbed the slope in silence. Breath plumes puffed around their scarves. The trail wound between stunted oaks, then narrowed to a path cut into frozen limestone. Halfway up, Jack's boot slipped, scattering chips of ice. Pete's hand was there instantly, firm and sure. Keep low, he murmured. Don't fight the hill. Walk with it. At the top, the land leveled. A stand of cedar trees broke the wind, their dark needles whispering even in still air. And then, cut into the bluff itself, the cave mouth appeared, wide enough for 3 men to walk shoulder to shoulder, tall enough for smoke to breathe. From within came the faintest glow, orange light alive against stone. A sentry stepped forward, shadow first, then man. He wore a heavy coat patched with canvas, and his beard carried frost like silver threads. Travelers? He asked. Friends, Pete answered. Winter riders. The man studied them for a long moment, then nodded once. Iron Mike says anyone can come in who carries respect with them. Trouble gets left at the door. We brought no trouble, Pete said. The sentry pulled aside a flap of canvas stretched across the cave's entrance, and heat rolled out like a blessing. Not soft heat, the kind of heat that comes from a fire burning against real cold, steady, purposeful, made to last. Inside was a world apart from the storm outside. The cave's stone walls glowed with firelight from 2 great pits dug into the floor, their smoke drawn upward through cracks that led to natural chimneys. Around the fires, men and women sat on crates, boards, even smooth stones, wrapped in their layers of cloth and newspaper. The smell was wood smoke and beans, a faint note of coal, and the sharper tang of damp wool drying too close to flame. Iron Mike, the sentry called. New hands. From the far side of the fire, a figure stood. He was tall, shoulders wide like the frame of a barn. His overcoat was patched, but well kept. His boots heavy, soles thick with hobnails. His beard was black, streaked with gray, his eyes steady and sharp. When he moved, it was with the weight of someone used to both command and labor. You made it through the storm, he said, voice like a deep bell. That alone says you've learned something. Come, sit, warm yourselves. No man proves anything by freezing on my floor. They followed him to a spot by the fire. Blankets were offered without words, a dented tin mug of hot chicory brew pressed into each of their hands. Jack sipped first, the bitterness sharp, but the warmth traced down his throat and lit his chest. He hadn't realized how empty he'd been until that moment. Thomas sat quietly, eyes fixed on the flames, the weight of recognition tugging at him. This place, it felt like the ending of something, and the beginning of something else. Pete watched him carefully, seeing the boy in the man, seeing his own son in both. Iron Mike sat across from them, elbows on his knees. Tell me your road, he said. Pete told it plain. The storm, the freight cars, the family in need, the newspaper method, the code that had carried them here. He left out nothing and added no polish. Truth was the only coin Iron Mike seemed to accept. When Pete finished, Mike nodded. Good, you know the rules. You passed them on. That's how men survive winters like this. Alone, you die. Together, you might just make it through. He leaned back, studying Thomas now. And you've got the look of a man who's been hunted by his own ghosts. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, but didn't look away. Looking for family, he said simply. Iron Mike's eyes softened. That makes two of you, he said, glancing at Pete. The silence that followed was thick, but not heavy. Just the kind of silence that waits for someone to name it. Jack broke it. Before we settle in, there's something we have to do. A telegram. Iron Mike's face broke into a faint smile. You're in luck. Got a line in town that don't ask too many questions. One of our own works, The Keys. You'll get your words out tonight. Relief spread between them like another fire. Pete exhaled slowly, a weight he'd carried for years lifting just a little. We'll send it at first light, he said. Found Thomas. Together. Safe. Make it simple, Mike agreed. Too many words raise eyebrows. But simple words carry far. Later, after beans and hard bread, after stories traded in low voices, Jack found himself walking the edges of the cave. On one wall, carved initials and dates layered the stone like a hidden history. He traced one with a finger. 1931, underlined twice. The man beside him noticed. Every winter, the man said, we mark who made it here. Some don't, but those who do leave their mark. Proof that we endured. Jack thought of his warm apartment back in Chicago, the life he'd lost, and then he thought of this. Men leaving marks not for glory, but for survival, for memory. When he returned to the fire, Pete was speaking quietly with Mike. A boy, maybe 20 then, blonde hair, sharp eyes, answered to Thomas. Ever pass through here? Mike scratched his beard, thinking, I've had a dozen boys through with that look. But yes, there was one, maybe 2 winters back. Came out of the North Line, knew some tricks, but not enough. Stayed 2 nights, left west with a group headed Denver way. Said he was looking for someone. Pete's face tightened, then loosened again. Could be him. Could be. Then you've still got a trail, Mike said firmly. And as long as there's a trail, there's a chance. The 3 of them bedded down that night in the warmth of the bluff cave. For the first time in weeks, Jack slept deeply. No rattling wheels under him, no icy wind searching for seams, just steady firelight against stone and the rhythm of men breathing together. At dawn, Mike's man guided them into town, through alleys where frost clung to bricks. The telegraph office stood by the freight depot, plain wood painted in weathered green. Inside, a thin man with spectacles tapped out messages without looking up. Pete stepped forward, words folded in his palm. The clerk read them once, nodded, and began his work. Found Thomas. Stop together. Stop. Safe stop. Each tap carried across miles of frozen ground, across wires strung like steel veins through America, across rivers and fields and cities, until it reached Sacramento, until Alice would see the paper slip and know. When they stepped back into the cold, the sun was climbing over the rooftops. Their journey wasn't done. St. Louis still lay ahead, and Denver beyond that. But something had shifted. The road was no longer just survival. It was a story bending toward reunion. Morning light turned the river to hammered brass. Frost haloed every rail and fence post. A choir of tiny suns glinting in the cold. The telegraph office door creaked as they stepped in again. Pete, Thomas, and Jack. Boots tapping a soft rhythm on the worn plank floor. Same clerk, same wire, a different kind of waiting. Anything for Gardner? Pete asked, voice low but steady. The clerk slid a ledger closer, finger tracing rows of names. He adjusted his spectacles, squinted, and then nodded. Once, like a judge delivering a verdict. Came in an hour ago, he said, and handed over a narrow strip of paper. Pete didn't move for a heartbeat. The way a man pauses before he opens a door he isn't sure he deserves to go through. Then he unfolded the message. His eyes moved line by line. His breath caught. He read it again. When he looked up, the years had shifted on his face. Read it, Thomas whispered. Pete swallowed. Thomas, my boys. Thank God stop. Come home when you can stop. I never stopped waiting. Stop, I always knew you were teaching someone something out there. Stop, I love you both. Stop, Alice. The room, with its ticking clock and tapping key, seemed suddenly larger, warmer. Thomas laughed, an open, surprised sound that didn't belong to the rails. Jack felt it too, that uncoiling inside the chest when a held breath finally leaves the body. Home, Thomas said softly, testing the word as if it might crack. She said home. Pete let the paper rest in his palm like a fragile bird. She waited, he said. It wasn't a boast. It was wonder. Outside, the cold nipped them the way a happy dog nips, insistent, harmless, eager to be noticed. They walked back through town, past the coal piles, past a grocer's window with a pyramid of cabbages, past a boy sweeping steps with a broom twice his height. The city was working again after the storm, wheels turning, hands busy. There was a comfort in the ordinary bustle. Back at Iron Mike's Bluff, the cave felt like a lung, breathing easy. Fires banked to a steady glow, men mending, scraping, stirring. The sentry gave a small nod as they entered, like he could read the answer on Pete's face. Good news? He asked. The best. Pete said simply. Iron Mike listened, without interrupting, then clapped a hand to Pete's shoulder. Then this is a chapter, not an ending, he said. Chapters need plans. Plans. That word could sound like chains. Today, it sounded like shoes laced tight, ready to carry weight. They spread a hand-drawn map on a crate. The river curled like a sleeping cat. Rail lines reached like fingers. Iron Mike pointed with a thick, scarred finger. 2 ways west from here, he said, quick and mean through the main yards. Heavy bulls, fast freights, higher chance of trouble. Or the long way south, then back west, lighter patrols, slower lines, more days to feed. Winter favors patience, not bravado. Pete listened, jaw working a steady rhythm. Spring would be safer, he admitted. But spring is far. Alice is far, and we're still winter riders. Mike nodded. Then you ride smart. You don't outrun bulls. You outthink them. You don't beat the weather. You rid it like a carpenter reads grain. Thomas traced the southern arc with a fingertip. Food and water? Mike's eyes warmed. You sound like Sally. Good. There's a church pantry here that doesn't ask questions. A butcher who sets aside fat trimmings for soap makers, and a yardman at Mill Creek who hates the bulls more than he loves his supervisor. A grin, which makes him generous. Jack took notes in tidy columns, places, people, signals, the small trade goods that grease a winter lane, wire, matches, needles, the miracle of a clean rag in a filthy world. He added one more line you couldn't draw on a map. Lesson flow. What they knew now, what they still had to practice before leaving. Iron Mike sent them to Sally's corner of the cave with a note. She arrived 15 minutes later with a crate that clinked softly. Tin flasks, bacon ends, small wrapped parcels. Congratulations, she said to Pete with a smile that reached her eyes. Alice has more patience than the rest of us combined. She always did, Pete replied, and the way his voice lifted on did told everyone in earshot the telegram was still ringing in him like a bell. Sally laid out the kit like a field surgeon. You don't ride west on hope. You ride on systems. She tapped each item. 2-stage water rotation underclothes, nut meal packets sewn into the hem of your coats, bacon diced small, jerky cut thin, sugar rations for thinking, not snacking. 1 pinch per crisis. And this, she lifted a tiny wrapped square. Chocolate, rare, precious, for morale, not hunger. Thomas laughed. Mom used to bribe us with chocolate to keep quiet during church. Sally winked. Now I bribe winter itself. The day passed in the generous hush that falls over a camp preparing for a journey. Some men made jokes louder than usual, the way a man talks loud while he tightens his belt. Others moved quiet and efficient, tightening, checking, retying. Pete and Thomas disappeared into a side chamber with rope and canvas to practice quick shelter drills. Build and strike, until their hands could do it, even if their minds were numb. Jack worked with Iron Mike on reading the yard, the pattern of patrols, the blind spots, the safe shadows, where a man could be invisible, even in daylight if he kept still. At dusk, packets were sewn, knots checked, boots greased with tallow. Sally did the accountant's work of portioning 5 days of rations, stretched to 7 by discipline. You're not eating, Thomas said gently when she skipped herself in the count. I'm wintered in, she said. You're wintering out. That's different math. By firelight, Pete pulled the telegram again. The paper had creases now, new ones where his thumb had worried the edge. He read it one more time, and then folded it carefully and slipped it into an inner pocket, right over his heart. Old debts, he murmured. Time I paid some. Jack looked up. Debts? Pete stirred the coals with a stick, sparks swirling like orange snow. I left because I thought I had to become something before I came back. A man with a job, a plan, an answer. He shook his head. Turns out I had to become someone else entirely. Now I just have to carry that someone home. Thomas leaned into his father's shoulder. We'll carry him together. Night came full. The bluff breathed its slow stone breath. Somewhere outside, the river cracked and sighed as ice shifted. In the far chamber, someone played a tune on a mouth harp, thin, bright, a ribbon of summer air in winter stone. Before sleep, Iron Mike knelt by the fire with them one last time and spoke the old words, half blessing, half checklist. Keep your head warm, your hands dry, your paper layered. Rotate water, count doors by paces. In yards, be boring. In storms, be small. If you help, help fast. If you hide, hide still. And remember, winter is a contract you negotiate every hour. They slept in their clothes, packs pillowed under heads, laces half tied for quick movement. Morning would come with its own orders. It did, a steel blue dawn, the kind that makes even smoke look like it's shivering. They ate hot broth in silence, too focused to waste words. Sally pressed the morale chocolate into Thomas's hand. Don't be a hero, she said. Be precise. We will, he promised. Iron Mike walked them to the path down the bluff. At the lip, he stopped. This place remembers people, he said quietly. Leave it better than you found it. We will, Pete echoed. And when you reach Alice, Mike added, tell her there's a room here next winter if she needs it. Families make a camp stronger. Pete blinked. I will. He wasn't a man who stumbled over words. Today, he led himself. They went down the cut path, Pete first, then Thomas, then Jack. The city waited with its yards and wires and eyes. The river glinted like a blade. At the tree line, they crouched, watching patrols move along the perimeter. Coats, clubs, the hard look of men who thought their job was the same as order. Jack felt his pulse climb. Then he counted it down. 4 beats in, 6 beats out. The way Pete had taught him. Fear is a spark, not a fire. Use it to see. Second gap after the coal bunker, Pete murmured. 2-minute window. We take it slow. We look like we belong. He touched Thomas's coat, tugged a seam flat, tapped the pocket where the telegram lay. We belong. The window opened. 3 figures shifted with the yard's rhythm. Never hurrying, never pausing too long. Sliding through a seam in the pattern. No running, no looking back. Just the steady confidence of men who had practiced this walk in a cave by firelight until their legs remembered it on their own. Inside the maze of steel, the world compressed to clangs and breath, and the smell of iron rust and old coal. They moved car to car, reading numbers, reading shade, reading the language of winter in the way ice gripped a ladder rung or snow feathered along a brake hose. Their car was waiting, door cracked, a shadow offering. Pete glanced at Thomas. You take the handle, he said, voice even. I'll spot. Thomas took it clean, up, swing, in, then reached back, strong and sure, to haul his father through. Jack followed, rolling to softly meet the wooden slats. The door slid a hand's width, and no more. Quiet, always quiet. They lay on the floor, listening. The breath of the yard, the footfalls of bulls receding. Then, faint and miraculous, the whistle further down the line. Couplers thumped, slack ran out. The car nudged, then pulled, then glided. St. Louis began to unspool behind them, inch by inch, yard by yard, rail by rail. Pete put a palm flat to the wood, feeling the motion settle into a rhythm he knew better than any prayer. He looked at his son. He looked at Jack. He touched the pocket where Alice's words lived. West, he said softly. A direction, a promise, a road. And the rails, cold and shining, said yes. The city loosened its grip, one switch at a time. Clanks faded. The yard's hard breath softened, and the rails settled into their older language, steel speaking to steel in long, even sentences. Sun climbed a finger width above the horizon, pale and clean. The boxcar held its own weather, cold, yes, but orderly, tamed by knowledge and a measured faith in routine. South line, Pete murmured, listening through the floor. Hear that? Wider spacing, softer grade. Yards put us on the long curve. Thomas smiled. A quiet, upward tilt. Thin patrols, slow towns, places to breathe, places to think, Jack added, and the three of them felt the words land like a small fire catching. They worked without hurry. Pete rigged a half shelter, not the full corner fortress, just a wind baffle and floor barrier. Canvas stretched drum tight, papers layered neat as shingles. Thomas checked the door track for rime, rubbed the runners with tallow, wiped the handle to a dull, non-reflective sheen. Jack inventoried the rations Sally had portioned. Nut meal packets in a cloth roll, jerky cut thin, bacon ends wrapped like coins, sugar folded into paper, twists no bigger than a thumbnail, 2 matches taped together back to back for sturdier striking, the morale square of chocolate, sealed in oilcloth, like a promise. Systems, not luck, Sally had said. The system calmed them now. Wind ticked along the boards, curious, then moved on. The car took a gentle bend. Somewhere outside, a stand of cottonwoods wrote cursive shadows across the snow. The day found its rhythm. Check layers. Sip water, warm from the body. Scan for drafts. Rest in turns. No heroics, only precision. Yardcraft rules. South Line edition, Pete said after a time, voice steady as a plumb line. Rule 1, we don't chase speed. We court predictability. Fast freights look sleek, but they pull you into bad decisions. Slow lines give you margin. Thomas nodded. Rule 2, he added, watch for towns that work with riders. A single friendly pump can be worth more than a trainload of good intentions. Jack took the third. Rule 3, when you leave a place, leave it better. A folded paper, a knot left pre-tied, a trick written in someone's hands. Pete's mouth tugged into a rare grin. You've been listening. They ate little and often. 3 mouthfuls of nut paste, softened with a thumb of melted snow. A sliver of jerky, warmed between glove and palm until it bent. A sip of water rotated from chest to coat, to armpit like a slow, careful dance. Hunger stayed quiet when fed on schedule. Thirst kept civil when not asked to wait too long. By late morning, the line eased beside a river, in no hurry to choose between water and ice. Far banks showed dark lines of trees, farmhouses shrugging deeper into themselves against the cold. At a whistle stop, nothing more than a pump shed and a drifted platform. The train slowed to a respectful crawl, took water, and sighed like an animal, comforted. Patrols? Jack asked, head near the crack at the door. Sparse, Pete said, listening. This line's watched by habit, not zeal. They stayed put. Shadows inside a shadow. Even friendly places could turn sharp if a man made the wrong kind of sound at the wrong time. Quiet was its own currency. They spent it carefully. When the train pulled again, Pete taught the map you carry in your bones, the one you draw by sound and sway. Flatiron sings, Bridges hum through the boards, thinner, higher. Timber trestle feels springy underfoot. Listen. He tapped 2 fingers to the floor as they crossed a span, and the tone lifted like a kettle just before boil. That's a river's voice in steel. Thomas leaned in, eyes bright. Teach me the switch count. Always, Pete said. Counting is free. At noon, cloud slid thinly across the sun, and the light turned pewter. Temperature dropped a notch, a gentle reminder that winter still owned the deed to the land, even if the tenants were industrious. They pulled the shelter flap closer, left the vent the width of a matchstick, breathed through wool. Their small world held. The first town worth a name announced itself with a sawmill's perfume, sap and steam, and honest work. 2 boys on a fence waved at the moving train. A barking dog remembered that rails can be barked at forever without losing. The water stop came with a church steeple, a faded billboard, a line of laundry crisping into boards on a clothesline despite someone's stubborn hope. Mike's pantry, Thomas said, recalling the map. Church that doesn't count. Later, Pete answered. We count first. He meant the count of trouble. A patrol walked the pump shed, hands deep, faces red, shoulders relaxed. Habit, as he'd said, no clubs out, no lantern slashes. They weren't hunting. They were winter men keeping winter hours. Next town, Pete decided, save the luck, spend the margin. They rolled on. Afternoon took a breath and lengthened. Shadow grew long spines along the car's inside corners. Jack dozed and woke in patient increments, each waking for a task. Check a knot, turn a flask, read the air. The work quieted deeper thoughts into something manageable. The telegram sat where Pete had tucked it, warm from his chest. The words doing their work without being read again. You thinking of her? Thomas asked, eyes on the boards so the question could be easy. Every mile, Pete said. Thomas nodded. Me too. They let that be enough. Mid-afternoon brought a bridge with iron lattice sides and a river below taking the shape of the wind. Ice scalloped, water ink black in narrow seams. The tone in the boards turned cathedral hollow. When they cleared it, all 3 exhaled like they'd walked a high beam without looking. Yardcraft Rule 4, Pete said softly. You don't pray for luck, but you say thank you to bridges. The next stop was the right one. A lantern hung from a pump, like an old idea, bright without boasting. Beside it, a coal bunker made a windbreak. Across the road, a church door stood open. A line of men filing past, each leaving with something wrapped in brown paper, and a nod like they were paying for it with a story told last week. Window, Pete judged, peering through the crack. 3 minutes. They slid the door just wide enough for a man and a promise. Snow squealed under boots. Daylight sharpened their faces, and cold took their breath for tribute. They moved the way they'd practiced, not sneaking, because sneaking draws eyes, but belonging. Pete first, hat brim low, a carpenter going about a carpenter's errand. Thomas tucked behind him, carrying nothing, looking like a son who'd fetched the wrong wrench and would fetch the right one now. Jack last, quiet, shoulders square, the look of a man who knows the route to the spare bolts. Across the road, the soup line's steam smelled like memory. A woman with sleeves, rolled to strong forearms, ladled into tin cups, without asking questions. Pete lifted 2 fingers, please and thank you, in the same small sign, and she filled 3 cups and added a crust to each. Swift, and practiced. He reached for his pocket. She shook her head once. Snow's a sermon, she said. Everybody hears it. Eat. They ate standing in the lee of the bunker, heads together to keep the heat in, hands cupped around tin. Thin soup felt magnificent. The crust softened against the steam and tasted like summer had been saved and set aside just for this moment. A boy from the yard drifted near, eyes flicking to the cups, then to their coats, then to their faces. He had the yard look, curious but careful, feral and friendly in alternating flickers. Coal's light on the east spur, he offered, which wasn't about coal at all. Switch sticks on the third throw. Thank you, Pete said, and passed him half his crust. The boy took it, slow and grateful, like it was a secret handshake for a club you'd never joined twice. They returned to the car before the third minute, slid the door to its thumb width, and tucked the heat back into their small winter. No horns blew, no boots pounded. The town reassembled its regular day, like a deck of cards squared after a trick. They rode in companionable silence a while. Soup warmth lasted longer than soup. Later, Jack set up a small lesson, Sally's thin-cut test. He held a strip of jerky to the light. If it threw ruby at the edges, thin enough. If it went brown and stubborn, too thick. He'd cut this batch right. It bent without cracking. Small pleasures counted. Evening leaned in, throwing the sky from a steel to violet, to the color of coal before flame. They rigged the shelter fully now, night protocols, and checked each other's hands in the lamplight for that treacherous waxy look that means heat has forgotten a place. All 10 fingers, pink, prickly, alive. All 10 toes, too, by unanimous, solemn vote. Watch order, Pete said. Thomas first. You're lightest on your feet in a slow sway. Jack second. You read the air like a clerk reads the ledger. I'll take the graveyard. You'll read the telegram, Thomas said, smiling. I will, Pete admitted. Night on the South Line was a quilt of quiet interruptions. A distant coyote considering the moon, a farmhouse lamp crossing a window like a ship, the train's steady vowels. In the second watch, a thin fog grew from the river and began to lace itself through the bottomlands. Frost patterned the inside canvas in fern shapes. Jack cracked the vent, a hair to keep breath from turning to glitter. Precision again. Always. Toward dawn, the train slowed for a wide curve, then slowed further, then paused. No whistles, no shouts, just the long inhalation of a line thinking about its next sentence. Grade ahead, Pete said from the dark, already awake. Or a meet, they waited. Stars thinned, cold sharpened, then relented by a finger's width. The world held its breath. And then, there it was, the answering thunder of an oncoming freight. It passed, a litany of faces and crates and open mouths of cars. A rider in one shadow saw their shadow and lifted 2 fingers, please and thank you, and good luck, and Jack lifted 2 back. There are dialects only winter teaches. When the last car sighed past, their train gathered itself and moved. Dawn spilled tin onto the snow. A hawk sailed low over stubble, unconcerned with human arithmetic. The South Line unspooled, patient, exact, generous. Pete checked the pocket where Alice's words lay and exhaled as if he were breathing them out to frost and back again. Thomas tightened his laces, double knot exact. Jack folded the ration cloth and retied it 1 hole tighter. Order inside scarcity. the old miracle. Today, Pete said, not loudly. We ride small. We ride steady. We ride toward her. South line, slow line, thin patrols, and a long curve toward home that felt, for once, like it wanted to be ridden. The boxcar swayed against the groaning rails, its iron walls rattling as the storm outside intensified. Snow, once falling gently like drifting feathers, now hurled itself against the seams of the train in angry waves. The wind screamed with a ferocity that felt almost alive, as though the storm itself were testing the resolve of every soul within its reach. Pete sat rigidly against the corner post of their improvised shelter, his weathered face illuminated by the faint glow of a stub of candle. Every line etched in his skin seemed to deepen as he listened to the howling outside. Jack could see it, the calculation happening behind Pete's eyes, the quiet way he measured danger against experience. Thomas, curled in the middle between the men for warmth, lifted his head, his breath crystallizing in the dim light. It's worse than I've ever seen, he whispered, voice muffled through his newspaper wrappings. His youth carried a tone of awe as much as fear. Pete gave a grave nod. This is what winter riders call a killer storm. When the snow comes sideways and the wind finds every crack in steel and wood, when even the rails seem to vanish beneath the white. Jack shivered, not from cold alone, but from the weight of Pete's words. He had thought he had already faced the worst that the Depression and its brutal winters could throw at him. Yet as the storm battered their frail corner shelter, he realized survival was never a matter of confidence. It was a matter of constant vigilance. Time to work, Pete ordered softly, his voice calm but firm. Storm's only beginning its fury. If we don't strengthen this shelter now, it won't matter how much food or fire tricks we've got. Thomas immediately pushed himself upright, eager despite exhaustion. Together, father and son began layering additional sheets of newspaper across the walls. Jack joined them, tucking pages into every crevice where cold air might sneak through. Their fingers, already numb, fumbled against the stiff paper, but urgency drove them forward. Pete demonstrated again, his motions precise, even under duress. Overlap the corners, always overlap. You're not patching cracks. You're weaving armor. The air pockets, trapped inside the paper, will keep the heat in. If we deny the wind its way through. Jack marveled at how Thomas followed his father's instructions with growing skill. His hands moved quickly now, muscle memory setting in from the lessons Pete had drilled. In the faint glow of the candle, the boy's face was set with determination, not fear. It struck Jack that he was witnessing something more than a survival lesson. It was a father teaching his son how to endure a world that had turned cold in every sense. When their shelter was as tight as they could make it, Jack rummaged through their packs. Sally's careful rations sat bundled in cloth, each portion deliberately small. High-fat foods, dried strips of meat, nut meal pressed into dense cakes, provisions designed not to freeze solid, designed to be carried through storms like this. Thomas whistled quietly when Jack unwrapped a small cache sewn into Pete's coat lining. That's smart. Emergency reserves hidden right on you. Pete gave a faint smile. That's Sally's doing. Best strategist I ever met on the rails. Taught me that food is more than calories. It's foresight. Every bite you prepare ahead of time is one less chance for the cold to win. Thomas's eyes widened at the name. Survival Sally. I've heard of her. Writers talk about her like she's a legend. They say she survived a Nebraska blizzard that killed 2 men with her. That's her, Pete confirmed simply, though his tone carried a quiet respect, though she never tells that story herself. Jack portioned out the food as Pete instructed. Tiny shares, barely a mouthful each, but enough to trick the stomach into hope. They chewed slowly, letting the richness of fat and protein work through their bodies. In the harsh arithmetic of winter riding, even a scrap of meat could mean an extra hour of strength. Suddenly, the rhythm beneath them changed. The clatter of wheels over rails slowed, softened, then faded entirely. The train shuddered once and stopped. For hours, they had been lulled by its steady movement. But now the silence was eerie, unsettling. The drifts are too deep, Pete said grimly, glancing toward the observation port. We've stopped completely. The words fell like a hammer. A train halted in wilderness during a storm could become a coffin of steel. For the prepared, it was a test of endurance. For the unprepared, it was a death sentence. What's the plan if we're stranded? Thomas asked, his voice level, though his eyes betrayed worry. Pete regarded him with approval. Good question. You never assume motion will last forever in winter. If we're stuck more than 2 hours, we assess. If near a town, we move. If not, we shelter in place, reinforce insulation, share body heat, ration food. That's stationary survival protocol. Jack felt the weight of the silence afterward. The protocol sounded efficient, logical, yet it was also terrifying in its finality. Waiting in one spot while the storm howled outside was an act of faith, faith in their knowledge, faith in the strength of newspaper walls, faith in the fragile human body to resist what nature hurled against it. They huddled together, reinforcing every seam, layering themselves as carefully as their shelter. Pete placed Thomas in the middle position, pressed between himself and Jack. The center stays warmest, he explained. Rotate every 2 hours. Fairness keeps everyone alive. Jack noticed the peace on Pete's face as he settled beside his son. Despite the storm raging outside, despite the unknown hours ahead, there was something almost tender in the way Pete rested a hand lightly on Thomas's shoulder. After 3 years of searching, of near misses and false trails, father and son were together again. That alone created a heat beyond body warmth. Thomas shifted slightly, voice low. Mom kept your tools, Dad. Said you'd need them when you came home. Pete's eyes glistened. The storm outside mirrored in the storm within. He did not answer immediately. His gaze dropped to the floor, where their candles' flicker painted long shadows. When he finally spoke, his voice was hushed. I should have gone straight to her. Pride got in the way. Thought I had to rebuild first, to bring something back. But maybe all she wanted was me. The truth lingered in the air, raw and undeniable. The depression had stripped so much from families across the country. Homes, work, certainty. Yet here, in a frozen steel car, the simplest truth held the greatest weight. Family was worth more than any rebuilt workshop. The hours dragged as the storm reached its peak. Snow sifted through cracks despite their efforts, forming tiny drifts inside the boxcar. Their breath condensed into crystals, glittering like frost jewels on the newspaper walls. This is the coldest night I've ever known, Jack admitted during a rotation. His teeth chattered despite the insulation wrapped around him. 40 below outside, Pete estimated, his tone clinical but heavy, closer to 70 with the wind chill. At such temperatures, Jack knew exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Their carefully layered cocoon was holding, but only just. He marveled at the strange duality of their situation, death howling mere feet away, life maintained only by knowledge and proximity. They rotated again, Jack finding himself in the middle position, surrounded by the warmth of others. He felt an almost guilty comfort. He thought about his own journey, the banker who had once lived in heated apartments, who had dined at tables with white linens, who had once believed life was secure. That man had vanished the moment the market crashed. Now he was something else, a winter rider, huddled in a frozen steel car, kept alive by newspapers and body heat, and somehow he was grateful for it. Outside, the storm continued, indifferent to human survival or reunion. Yet inside, three people shared more than warmth. They shared knowledge, memory, and something even rarer in those bleak years, hope. Pete's voice cut through the silence at one point, steady as the rhythm of a locomotive. Remember this night, not the cold, not the fear, but the lesson. When the world strips you bare, what keeps you alive isn't what you carry, it's what you share. The words settled like another layer of insulation, wrapping them against despair. Jack realized then why writers whispered Pete's name across the country. He was more than a survivor. He was a teacher, passing on methods that meant life itself. The storm raged, the train groaned, the night stretched long, but in that fragile shelter, a father, a son, and a friend endured together, living proof that even in the coldest hours of the Depression, warmth could be found in the simplest things: shared food, shared knowledge, and the shared will to outlast the storm. The boxcar had become a lung, breathing in frost and breathing out hope, each of them taking their turn to keep the small, fragile climate alive. Outside, the storm eased by barely a degree, the wind slackening from a scream to a ragged moan. It wasn't mercy, it was an opening. Pete checked his watch, then the seam of canvas above their heads. 2 hours stranded, he murmured. Time to decide. Thomas's eyes were steady. If we're near a town, we go. If not, shelter in place. Pete nodded. Shelter in place, but with an addition. He tilted his head toward the boxcar door. We check the neighbors. Jack knew what that meant. Risk. The kind that didn't announce itself until you were already in it. But he also knew the code, the one Pete repeated whenever they'd passed a rider's footprints in blown snow or seen smoke from a hidden jungle. Knowledge shared is lives saved. He pulled his scarf higher and tightened the cloth strip around his wrist. Preparation was ritual. Pete doubled their face layers, leaving only narrow eye slits. He wound cord twice around his own waist, then passed the line to Jack. If visibility goes to 0, he said, we come home by touch. Thomas shifted to the center of the shelter, already taking over the fireless chores. I'll hold here. If the wind rises, I seal the port and maintain rotation. He glanced at Jack. Bring back what you find, or bring back yourself. In this cold, you don't trade both. They slid the door just wide enough to spill a sheet of white into the car. The cold struck with the weight of iron. Breath clawed their throats. Snow, waist deep in places, had set in hard-backed drifts, sculpted by the night's fury. The train stretched away into a world of white and gray, its edges softened, the steel subdued. "15 feet," Pete shouted over the gusts. Door should be iced. The wind gnawed their balance as they waded to the next car. Pete's gloved knuckles went white around the metal tool he kept buried in his coat. One quick wedge, a lever, a crack of resisting ice. The door yielded with a groan, and a blast of colder air rolled over them from inside. "Hello," Pete called. His voice was swallowed by the dim. "Anyone writing?" A tremor of sound answered from the corner. Half voice, half teeth. Help. Please." They moved toward it, every step an argument with numbness. Two shapes, one draped over the other, huddled beneath a thin, ragged blanket. The man's eyes were open, but unfocused. The woman's were closed, lashes rimmed with frost. Their clothes were city thin. "Wrong for this world. Newlyweds," the man managed, the words shattering on his chattering jaw. "Illinois. Couldn't afford fare." "No more talking," Pete said. "Already working. We warm first. Talk later." Emergency protocols took over. Movements drilled into muscle by nights like this. Wet outer layers stripped away, dry paper crinkled, wrapped, overlapped, always overlapped. Cloth strips cinched the seams. Jack worked the woman's legs, layer by layer, sealing the knee joint the way Pete had taught him. Not too tight to cut flow, not too loose to invite cold. The man was lucid enough to help with his own chest, but his fingers failed him. Pete took the task without comment. "Core first," Pete said. Voice even, hands and feet after. "We don't warm a body. We protect a furnace." The woman's head lolled when they lifted her. Her skin felt like chilled porcelain beneath Jack's glove. He swallowed against a spike of fear. "Can she walk?" "She'll have to," Pete said, measuring the door with his eyes. "Carry in this wind and you fall. One slip, and she's lost." He tightened a final binding, then drew the line between them tighter. 15 feet, he repeated. "Home is 15 feet. They pushed into the cut glass cold as a gust shouldered the door open. The woman staggered. The man swayed. Twice she nearly folded. But Pete's arm was a vice, and Jack's body became a wall for her to lean on. The snow fought them, crumbling and hardening again with each step. At the boxcar, Thomas was already at the door, eyes wide, but ready. "In," Pete said. Voice all command now. "Center position." The shelter flexed to fit 5. Jack and Thomas moved like they'd rehearsed it. Newlyweds in the middle, 2 heat sources flanking, Pete working fast. He packed snow into a small metal cup, pressed it against his ribs, beneath the paper, to melt. When it turned liquid, he added pinches of Sally's meat powder. Steam without flame, broth without fire, small sips. He guided the man. "Slow. It's a ladder, not a leap." He broke a cake of nut meal, mixed a smear with a pinch of sugar. "And this, your brain needs quick fuel." The woman's shivering turned violent, that dangerous, final stage before the drop. Jack and Thomas tightened the cocoon, their bodies the stove. He could feel the shiver pass through the layers, like a tremor, then begin to quiet, the way wind slowly loses interest in a wall it cannot move. "Names?" Pete asked when color started creeping back into the woman's cheeks. "Robert," the man said, steadier now. "This is Emma." "Robert and Emma," Pete repeated. "You were 10 minutes from losing fingers. Another hour, and the storm would have called your names for keeps." Emma blinked, the world rearranging itself into sense. Are you the men from the rails?" "The ones who we teach," Pete said simply. "That's what we do." Robert looked around at their papered walls, Newspaper. I thought it was a tall tale. Thomas, warmth returning to his voice, with his hands, shook his head. Trapped air isn't a tale. It's physics you can borrow from a city corner. They ate in thin, meaningful silence, rationed bites that tasted like promise. The storm, insulted by their quiet competence, tried one last time to punch through the seams, rattling the canvas with a hard slap before tapering back to spite. The shelter held. Can we help others? Emma asked after a while, her voice chapped but stronger. If there are more, there are always more, Pete said gently. We'll check as the wind dies. He waited. 10 minutes. 20. Watching the candle's flame behave like a barometer. When it stood up straight, he nodded once. We move again. Thomas opened his mouth to volunteer. Pete cut him off with a look that held love and leadership in equal measure. You maintain the shelter. You've got the two most at risk. That's the work that saves the living. Thomas's jaw tightened, then softened. Yes, sir. Rope. Rewraps. The ritual repeated. Jack and Pete pushed back into the whitening hush. This time, the world felt like the interior of a pearl. Soft, featureless, unkind. They opened car after car, two empty. A third, with an old man so cold it seemed his skin had forgotten how to be flesh. Frostbite had already written its black signatures on his fingertips. Moving him would invite the storm back in. Pete built a small hooded shelter where he lay, wrapped him, tucked food into his coat, and put the cup and snow within reach. When your hands wake up, Pete told him, crouched close so his voice could bridge the distance. Sip the broth. You don't race hypothermia. You outlast it. They moved again. The next car held two riders with passable shelters and poor food choices. Pete tightened their corner seams. Jack left portions of Sally's rations without ceremony. The gratitude felt like heat. Last car, Pete said at the threshold of the next door. His eyes were narrowed, shoulders set. Even masters get tired. Inside, 4 men looked up with wary, wolfish expressions that softened the moment Pete gave his name. Newspaper, Pete? One repeated. My brother used your method in Colorado. Kept his fingers. He held out a small tin. We got coffee. Saved it for the worst. This seems like it. It was hot enough to be miraculous. Jack held the tin and felt his bones remember a stove. Pete drank and passed it on without lingering. We'll be doubling back. Keep your seams tight. Pack your floor. They traced their rope back through the white silence, the path already drifting over, even as they walked it. Somewhere behind them, the storm cleared its throat, thinking about returning. Somewhere ahead, their shelter, warmth, order, the small economy of calories and breath, waited. When they pushed inside, the temperature drop off their coats felt like a fog. Thomas had Emma and Robert practicing the overlap pattern with scrap sheets, their movements clumsy but earnest. He looked up, relief blooming across his face at the sight of both men returning. How many? He asked quietly. Enough, Pete said. His eyes gave the rest. Some saved for now, 1 maybe not. 4 doing fine, 2 improved. We'll check again when the plow comes through. Robert and Emma shifted to make room, and the shelter, stretched to accept 5, exhaled, then settled. Pete recalculated rations out loud so everyone could hear the math. So many portions, so many hours. Adjust for effort, buffer for unknowns. When the wind finally laid down like an exhausted animal, the quiet was immense. Evening arrived without ceremony. a blue weight pressing against the canvas. They ate in the slow, careful way of people who have learned to trust small fuel. Thomas told a story to keep minds warm. A writer in Montana, a former Arctic man, snow caves that held like stone, a trick with matches protected in wax. Emma listened. Like breath itself was the tale. When night fell completely, they set watch. Pete took first. Thomas volunteered second. Jack woke from his shift to find the world transformed. The storm gone, the sky a black velvet river, stars scattered across it like sparks. The moon turned the drifts into sculpture. Beautiful, isn't it? Pete murmured, stepping up beside him at the port. Night after a blizzard always looks like a clean slate. He was quiet for a beat. We'll check the others again at first light, and if the plow's coming, we'll be ready. Jack nodded, feeling the truth of it deep in his chest. Outside, the white silence held. Inside, 5 lives pressed together under layered newspapers, canvas, and a code older than any winter. When you can, you help. When you can't, you hold. When you hold, you live. They slept in turns. They breathed in rhythm. Somewhere down the line, lanterns ticked to life. Crewmen testing the snow, measuring drifts taller than a man. And when the first faint whistle floated back through the frozen air, a sound like a promise, Pete's eyes opened, already counting the minutes to motion. The boxcar had become a cocoon. 5 people, pressed close in layers of paper, cloth, and shared breath, holding a bubble of warmth against the weight of the storm. Outside, the blizzard roared on through the dark hours, wind clawing at every seam, snow filtering in to collect in small drifts against the walls. But inside, the rhythm was steadier now. Shifts for sleep, shifts for watch, shifts for keeping the fragile order alive. Jack had the middle position in the first rotation, warmth pressing him from both sides. It felt almost comfortable, almost human again. His thoughts drifted, carried by the steady thrum of the rails beneath them. Here he was, a man who weeks earlier had been a hollow shadow in Chicago, now nestled between strangers who had become something closer to family. Pete's steady presence on one side, Thomas's quiet resilience on the other, and the couple, Robert and Emma, newcomers, yet already folded into the survival circle. This was what the rails gave in winter, unlikely bonds forged in the crucible of cold. The hours passed slowly. Wind shrieked, then paused, then howled again, like a wounded animal circling the train. Ice formed along the seams of their paper cocoon, little crystals glittering like stars in candlelight. Each breath condensed and froze, layering frost on scarves and coats. Even inside, the air was brittle. Coldest night yet, Jack murmured during his turn at watch. Pete stirred, his voice matter of fact. Warm front gave way. Arctic air rushed in. This is a drop of 30 degrees, maybe more. He paused, glancing at the frost forming on the inside planks. Outside, 40 below. Add the wind, closer to 70. Jack tried to picture it, 70 below, flesh freezing in minutes, metal brittle as glass. It was a scale of cold beyond imagining, the kind you couldn't fight, only endure. He wrapped his scarf tighter and leaned back against the wall, listening to the storm gnaw at their shelter. They rotated again. Pete in the middle this time, his son on one side, Jack on the other. The older man's expression softened, the lines of years easing slightly. Jack realized what that meant. For the first time in 3 years, Pete was sleeping next to his boy. After years of searching, missing, wondering, Thomas was here. That truth warmed him as much as body heat. The night stretched, endless. At times, Jack thought the storm might never end, that they would remain buried in this frozen tomb until the cold claimed them all. But then, slowly, he noticed the rhythm change. The wind softened its edge. The pressure in the air lifted slightly. The candle flame stood taller. When dawn finally came, it came gray and muted, light filtering through cracks like a faded memory of sun. Jack peered through the observation port, breath catching. Snow was piled high against the train, one side nearly buried, drifts like walls sculpted by the wind. The rails were invisible, swallowed by white. The train was an island in a frozen sea. "We're not moving soon," he said quietly. Pete joined him, face unreadable. "No, not until they send a plow." His tone wasn't fearful, only pragmatic. He had been here before. Robert stirred, rubbing his eyes, blinking at the thin stripes of light. Emma woke slower, but her color was better. Her breath no longer shallow. She touched her face, then her husband's hand. "We're alive," she whispered in wonder. "We really made it through the night." "You made it," Pete corrected gently. "Storm's not over, but the worst of it's past." They reorganized, adjusting layers, shaking out frost-clogged seams. Pete checked the insulation. Thomas double-wrapped weak spots. Jack portioned out the morning's ration, dried meat, nut paste, and a sliver of hard cheese. It was barely a handful, but rich with energy, enough to keep bodies fueled for another day of waiting. Emma frowned at the tiny portion. "This can't be enough," Thomas answered with quiet authority, echoing his father's tone. "It's not about fullness. It's about survival. High-fat food burns slow. You stretch it, you last." Robert nodded, chewing carefully. Sandwiches turned to rocks the first night. "We thought bread was enough." "It's knowledge," Pete said, his voice low, almost meditative. "Knowledge passed along. That's what makes the difference out here." As they ate, the storm's voice outside shifted again. Less of a howl now, more of a muted moan. Through the port, the sky cleared slightly, streaks of pale blue breaking the gray. Then, distant, faint, a sound carried on the still air. A whistle. "Plow train," Pete said instantly, leaning closer to listen. "Coming from the east. Couple hours, maybe less." Jack felt something stir inside him. A lift, fragile but real. The thought of motion, of progress, of leaving the blizzard behind. They passed the time with small tasks. Pete inspected each seam of the shelter. Thomas taught Robert how to overlap paper properly. The boy's fingers awkward but eager. Emma rested, regaining strength. Jack kept watch, scanning the landscape. White, silent, deadly, beautiful. By midday, the whistle grew louder, joined by the groan of engines. Then it appeared, massive locomotives, pushing a V-shaped plow taller than a man, steel biting into drifts, snow exploding to either side in glittering arcs. It was brute force against nature, and for once, man was winning. "Smart design," Pete muttered, with quiet admiration. "Rotary works better, but V-plow is cheaper. Gets the job done." The plow rumbled past, clearing one track, then vanishing west. It would return eastward to cut their path. The sound of it lingered like a promise. Inside, the shelter was calm. They had survived the storm, and survival bred a kind of fragile peace. Conversation turned to the future. Robert and Emma spoke of Springfield, Illinois, and the farm that waited there. Pete and Thomas spoke of California and of Alice, the mother who had never stopped waiting. Jack listened, silent, thinking of Chicago, of everything he had left, and of how much had changed since that first desperate night. When the train finally lurched, metal groaning against the frozen rails, Emma gasped. "We're moving," she said, joy breaking across her tired face. Actually moving. The sound of motion was the sweetest music Jack had ever heard. They were not safe yet. There would be more cold, more nights, more dangers. But the blizzard had passed, and the rails stretched eastward again. Pete checked his watch, then his son's face. "St. Louis tomorrow," he said. "If the tracks hold clear." Thomas smiled faintly. "Then what, Dad?" Pete hesitated, eyes on the snow-swept horizon. "Then we see if a family can be put back together." Jack leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. Outside, the white silence stretched on. Inside, 5 hearts beat steady. The storm had tested them. The storm had nearly broken them. But together, they had held, and now the rails would carry them forward. Dawn lifted the night from the rails like a veil. Frost blue light slid across the boxcar walls, finding every paper seam and sliver of canvas, spilling into the corners where 5 people had turned breath and patience into heat. The train moved again, slow, steady, deliberate, carving through Missouri toward the Mississippi. Each mile settled deeper into the wheel's rhythm. Clack, breathe, clack, breathe. The storm was behind them now. Ahead lay St. Louis, and choices no one could keep postponing. Pete mapped their progress the way old sailors read a sky. Landmarks slipped past, water towers, tree lines, the long, slow curves that lived already in his memory. Jefferson City by nightfall, he'd said, and they had. The newlyweds left there in a blur of grateful hands and quiet promises, shouldering a small bundle of Sally's rations and the big knowledge that had saved their lives. The car felt lighter without them, but warmer too, as if gratitude left its own kind of heat. By morning, the Mississippi was a sheet of steel under a colorless sky, smokestacks marking the city's edge like iron thorns. Thomas stood at the observation port, eyes bright, breath fogging the glass. "Almost there," he whispered. Pete joined him, the same words caught in his throat, shaped by years he couldn't quite swallow or speak. Almost there. The yard unspooled before them in a fever of tracks, parallel, crossing, splitting, freight cars stacked like giant rust-red bricks, wheels hissing and cold. Bulls would be thick here. Everyone knew it. St. Louis didn't forgive carelessness. Pete's voice slipped into the quiet tone of instruction that calmed nerves and saved bones. "Pack clean. No loose bits. Quiet straps. We jump together. Roll up, east to the tree line. Don't stop until you're under brush." They broke down the shelter with practiced hands. Canvas folded flat, cord coiled, newspaper bagged dry. Jack had learned to love the neatness of it. The way order gave courage. Everything had a place. Nothing rattled. He tightened his pack and watched Pete check Thomas's layers like a father fitting armor. One last tug at a binding, one last nod. Brakes sang metal on metal. The big train sighed, settling into its stop and shift choreography. Pete counted under his breath. Boxcars, sidings, the coal bunker he'd been waiting for. Then, soft but sure. Now, they slid the door low and clean and leapt as one. Snow cushioned the landing with a cold thump. Roll, up, run. The yard smell was oil and iron and old steam. Feet found purchase. Bodies threaded shadows, bare-limbed trees, beckoned like the narrow fingers of safety. They reached cover without a shout raised and let their lungs burn in silence. Pete glanced back once, reading the yard's mood like weather. Good, he said. We go. East through the snow, the city's pulse grew quiet and then closer, muffled by winter. Thomas's stride matched his father's. Without trying, Jack followed, feeling, not for the first time, that the rails had taken him apart and put him back together into someone steadier. The sun was thin, the day brittle, but the worst cold had passed, and motion itself felt like warmth. They found the jungle by its careful absence. No smoke above the bluff, no prints where prints would be obvious. Iron Mike ran a tight winter camp. They'd been told. A place that was safe, because it refused to advertise safety. A gap in brush, a slant of trail, a hush of wind angled strangely. Then the doorway, low and smart, cut into earth and limestone, reinforced with ties and corrugated tin. The bluff's ribs turned into shelter. The first heat was not temperature, but quiet. Inside, tunnels branched into rooms that breathed. No smoke pool, no stale air. Warm, not soft. Above freezing by design, not luck. Lantern light was turned low, and bodies moved in disciplined patterns. It felt like a mind had planned it, and hands had honored the plan. A big man stepped from deeper shadow, beard frost-lined, eyes knife-sharp, but not unkind. You made it, he said. It wasn't a question. Iron Mike's gaze flicked. Assessment, inventory, judgment, all in one sweep that missed nothing. You brought the storm with you. Then beat it, he said, a corner of his mouth lifting. Come warm your bones and tell it plain. They sat near a stove that ticked softly through its iron seams, heat rising steady from a fire that didn't waste itself. Vent chimneys snaked in a logic Jack couldn't name, but trusted immediately. Shelves held dry wood, not heaped, but measured. Blankets hung in staggered layers, with air gaps between, turning space itself into insulation. Everything said, learned lessons, remembered costs. News moved faster than trains on the rails, and Iron Mike already knew the half of their story. The rest came quiet. Junction City, Bill's engineering, Sally's rations and sugar rule, the blizzard, the rescue, the long white night. Iron Mike listened like a ledger, filing names and techniques where he could retrieve them later. Good, he said softly, at intervals that sounded like approvals stamped on a plan. Good, and good. When Pete spoke the line he'd been carrying like a live coal for years, I found my son. The big man only nodded, like a craftsman checking the last dovetail of a cabinet. Then we turned to what's next, he said. What's next was a small desk, a telegraph address book with edges softened by use, and a calm voice that taught without wasting a word. Use the Western Union off Dock Street, Iron Mike said. Night clerk's a friend. Keep the message short. Pay cash. 2 replies if she's got the means. Pete stood there too long, fingers almost on the pencil, as if letters might burn. Thomas eased close, shoulder to shoulder. 2 silhouettes with the same slope to them. I'll start, the boy offered gently. You finish. They wrote together, Alice. Found Thomas. Stop safe in St. Louis. Stop will write. Longer letter. Stop love Pete. Iron Mike read it once, nodded once, and folded it with ritual care. I'll see it sent, he said. You'll have your answer quick as wires can carry it. In the days that followed, the jungle held them like a well-made room. Work had a cadence. Water carried, vents cleared, tunnels checked, stores counted. Knowledge moved hand to hand. A lesson on frostnip from a veteran with hands like rope. A demonstration of emergency vent closures for sudden wind shifts. Jack learned the snow shelf trick built into the cave wall to keep bedding dry. The way heat stratified and had to be stirred with smart vents, not bigger fires. Small efficiencies added up to a margin, and the margin kept people breathing. At night, men spoke in tones that belonged to winter, low even, never frantic. Thomas traded stories with riders who had almost met him, almost pointed him toward his father, almost turned chance into reunion a dozen times. The rails were a lattice of almosts, Jack realized, runs that just missed until one didn't. The reply came on the third evening, paper thin as a leaf, words heavy as iron. Pete stood very still while he read, lips moving once, then twice. He passed the slip to Thomas, who smiled in a way that rewrote his face. Come home when you can stop. I never stopped waiting. Stop, I love you both. Stop, Alice. For a long moment, nothing moved. Even the stove seemed to hush. Then life returned to the room in the shift of a boot, the exhale of a lantern flame drawing air. Pete sat, hands open in his lap, as if setting down a load he'd carried too far for too long. Spring, he said finally, voice rough. We'll go in spring. Proper tickets if we can. West on the coach. Not a boxcar. He lifted his eyes to Thomas, to Jack. We saved our lives with the rails. We can leave them gentle. Iron Mike approved that too, with a single slow nod. 2 months, he said. I'll find you winter work. You'll sleep in warm stone and bank coin in a hidden tin. When the thaw runs, you'll walk to a station and sit like paying men. No bull will touch you. The plan set like mortar. Days began to count down, not toward the next storm, but toward a departure with seats and windows and heat. Thomas and Pete spent hours with a stub pencil, sketching a map of California from memory, a workshop with tools that had waited like loyal dogs, a kitchen where mornings tasted like coffee and bread, a porch that remembered summers even in winter. Jack listened and felt a tug he hadn't expected, something like envy, something like hope. Come west with us, Thomas said one evening, as if the decision could be spoken into being. Pete looked up from the map and added simply, You'd be welcome. The invitation warmed parts of Jack he had believed winter killed. He didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. Spring was 2 months off, time enough for a man to choose which life to step into when he stood. On the last night of the chapter of waiting, Jack took the late watch at the mouth of the tunnel. The city exhaled in the distance, river black and slow under the faint ice. Stars burned cold and steady. He thought of Chicago, of the first boxcar, of Pete's match flaring in the dark, and a voice saying, You've got 15 minutes before you're in serious trouble. He thought of the blizzard, of bodies stacked in a human furnace, of the plow's iron wedge, and the first lurch of movement after stillness. Mostly, he thought of a telegram that said, I never stopped waiting, and how, sometimes, the rails didn't end a life. They bent it toward where it needed to go. Behind him, the jungle breathed, careful warmth held in stone and discipline. Ahead, tracks gleamed under moonlight, running east and west like choices in polished steel. When morning came, they would start saving for tickets. When spring broke, they would buy them. For now, The city slept. The bluff held, and 3 men sat closer to a future than they had been in years. The Mississippi thawed slow, its surface cracked with plates of ice, drifting downstream like broken mirrors. The rails that had carried so much misery, so many frozen nights and whispered lessons, now hummed with the softer rhythm of spring. Each day, the sun lingered longer over the bluffs, dripping gold into the cracks of St. Louis, melting fear into mud. And in the shelter Iron Mike had carved with hands like stone, 3 men were finishing the last of their winter's work. Pete woke first, always, old habits rooted deep. Even now, when nights no longer threatened frostbite, with every exhale, he stirred before dawn, checked vents, stirred coals, pressed a palm against the stone walls to feel their temper. Stone holds memory, he told Jack once. You listen close. You can feel if the night's been cruel. Jack tried it, pressing his hand against limestone. He didn't feel cruelty. He felt endurance. And that, he realized, was Pete himself, scarred by seasons, but unbroken. Thomas grew stronger each week, his shoulders squared under steady meals, his eyes sharpened with confidence. He could layer a shelter in 15 minutes, repair a binding in the dark, and read the wind with the quiet certainty of men twice his age. Sometimes, watching him, Pete would reach for words, then stop, as if afraid they might break the spell of having his boy back alive. It was Thomas who finally said it one night, sitting by the stove's faint glow. You don't have to keep proving I'm here. Dad, I'm not going anywhere. Pete just nodded, swallowing something that felt larger than speech. Jack found a new rhythm too. He had been a clerk once, neat with ledgers and figures, but here he became something different. His hands learned to mend boots, patch canvas, chop wood at a measured pace. In the jungle, he wasn't the man who'd lost everything. He was a man who contributed. For the first time in years, he went to sleep, not thinking of what he had lost, but of what might still be possible. By late February, Iron Mike gave them the news. You're flush enough. He tapped a tin can with a carpenter's knuckle. Inside lay their winter's wages, coin saved from odd jobs, careful rationing, and the discipline Mike demanded of everyone under his bluff. Coach tickets west, he said simply. You've earned them. The words hit like sunlight after weeks of storm. Pete and Thomas exchanged a look, half disbelief, half fierce relief. Jack felt it too, though for him, the West wasn't a wife waiting, but something less defined. Still, the idea of riding a train with a seat and a window, of arriving by schedule instead of desperation, was almost more miraculous than survival itself. They packed carefully, no paper bundles this time, no hidden sacks, just modest packs with the essentials, a change of clothes, a little food, the telegram from Alice, folded until it was soft as cloth. Pete handled it like scripture, reading it nightly before sleep, lips shaping each word as though reciting a prayer. Their last night in the bluff was quiet. Men drifted by their corner to shake hands, share half smiles, or simply nod. Winter riders didn't always need words. Jack lingered longest at the stove, watching flames coil through iron grates. He thought of Sally's sugar ration. Dawn found them walking to the depot trick. Iron Mike, the storm that had like a silent escort. The city smelled of thawing river mud and newspapers, coal smoke like a miracle, and bread rising. Survival was never solitary. Ordinary, it was a chain, bustled with satchels and coats, hand to hand, faces old pink to with young, cold. That was stranger to stranger, but not deadly. He realized Jack felt almost invisible among them, As if the months of hardship for each other had wrapped him in a different fabric survival than the rest. It was dignity. Pete and Thomas carried the same quiet. They weren't part of this world yet, but they were stepping into it. Inside the depot, the ticket window gleamed like a portal. Pete laid down their tins worth of coins, sliding them across with a carpenter's steady hand. The clerk barely looked up, counted, stamped, tore 3 slips of stiff paper. Train west, 2 stops, coach class. Just like that, the rails that had once been their torment became their path home. The train was already waiting, steam blooming in white blossoms above it. Jack hesitated at the steps. For months he had climbed into boxcars in silence, always fast, always afraid. Now, there was no scramble, no bull to dodge, no wind to knife through him, just steps and a door that welcomed. Thomas bounded ahead, turning back to grin. Pete followed slower, hand brushing the rail as though blessing it. Jack climbed last, heart thudding with a strange mix of gratitude and grief. Seats, real seats, cushions worn thin but heavenly compared to splintered wood and steel, windows that framed the world instead of freezing it. Heat coiled from vents at their feet. Jack sank into his place, feeling as if he'd stumbled into a dream. Pete sat beside Thomas, hand resting briefly on his son's shoulder, grounding himself in the simplest miracle of all, presence. The whistle blew, long and mournful, echoing across the yard. The train shuddered, then moved. For a moment, all 3 men looked at each other. No words, just the recognition that something was ending, even as something else began. Through the window, the landscape opened, river bending away, city shrinking, horizon widening. Missouri fields stretched under thawing snow, black earth showing through like promises. Thomas pressed his forehead to the glass, narrating small things, farmhouses, windbreaks, the gleam of water. Pete listened, nodding, his eyes softer than Jack had ever seen, and Jack let the sound of rails carry him, not as threat, but as song. Hours passed, the rhythm settled into them, slower, gentler, no longer a countdown to frostbite, but a lullaby toward possibility. Somewhere beyond these tracks, a woman waited with years folded in her heart. Somewhere beyond, a boy would return not as a ghost, but as a son. Somewhere beyond, a man named Jack might decide he wasn't lost after all. As dusk spread, violet over the fields, Pete finally spoke, voice almost a whisper under the train's hum. You know, Jack, I used to think the rails took everything. House, wife, boys, pride. But maybe they were carrying me all along. Just slow. Just cruel. Just long enough to teach me what I'd need to still be alive when I finally arrived. Jack didn't answer right away. He looked out at the horizon, where the sun melted gold into black, and thought of all the men who hadn't made it, who'd been claimed by blizzards and bulls and hunger. He thought of Pete lighting a match in the dark, saying 15 minutes, and how sometimes survival begins with one stranger's voice. Maybe that's it, Jack said finally. The rails don't give, they test, and if you pass, maybe then they let you go. Pete nodded, slow, thoughtful. Thomas leaned back, eyes closing, safe enough to sleep in motion for the first time in years. The train carried them west, steady, relentless, the sound of wheels no longer a threat, but a hymn. And for the first time since 1929, newspaper, Pete allowed himself to believe that the ride might actually end where he wanted it to, at a front door in California, with his family whole again.